There once existed a land of eternal spring and perfect happiness. The ancient Greeks called this place Hyperborea, and its people lived for 1,000 years in a paradise where music filled the air and golden light bathed everything in warmth. This mystical northern kingdom represents one of humanity's oldest dreams, of a perfect world beyond the harsh realities of ordinary life. The story of Hyperborea begins in the misty depths of ancient memory, when the world was younger and the boundaries between myth and reality were far less certain than they are today. Long before the first Greek philosopher put stylus to wax tablet, stories circulated through the Mediterranean world about a blessed land in the far north where people lived in perfect harmony with nature and the gods. These weren't just idle tales told around evening fires. They were beliefs that shaped how ancient peoples understood their world and their place within it. The earliest whispers of Hyperborea come to us through fragments and hints scattered across centuries of Greek literature. The name itself tells us something profound about how the ancients imagined this place. Hyperborea means beyond Boreas, and Boreas was the Greek god of the north wind, a fierce deity who brought winter's chill sweeping down from the Arctic regions. But beyond his reach, past the source of his freezing breath, lay a land where his power could not extend. There eternal summer reigned in defiance of all natural law. When we first encounter Hyperborea in written records, it appears not as a fully formed narrative, but as references and allusions in texts discussing other matters. The poet Hesiod, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, seems to have known of the Hyperboreans, though his direct mentions are lost to time. What survives are later writers telling us that Hesiod spoke of this northern people in works that have not survived the centuries. This pattern repeats throughout ancient literature. We have echoes of echoes, each generation of writers building upon the foundations laid by their predecessors. The historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, provides us with some of our most detailed early accounts of Hyperborean beliefs. Writing in the 5th century, before the Common Era, he approached the subject with his characteristic mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He tells us that he personally did not believe in the existence of the Hyperboreans, yet he faithfully recorded what others said about them. This intellectual honesty gives us valuable insight into how widespread these beliefs were in his time. According to the traditions Herodotus recorded, the Hyperboreans lived beyond the lands of the Scythians, themselves a people dwelling in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. Beyond the Scythians lay a region of terrible cold and darkness, inhabited by people who slept for 6 months of the year. And beyond even them, past impassable mountains that no mortal could cross, lay Hyperborea. The geography was intentionally vague, placing this blessed land always just beyond the edge of the known world. What made Hyperborea so captivating to the ancient imagination was not just its physical perfection, but its spiritual significance. This was the birthplace of Apollo, the god of light, music, prophecy, and healing. Every year, the stories said, Apollo would leave his shrine at Delphi and travel north to spend the winter months among his beloved Hyperboreans. While Greece shivered through the cold months, Apollo basked in the eternal sunshine of his northern paradise, returning in spring to bring warmth back to the Mediterranean world. The connection between Apollo and Hyperborea runs so deep that we cannot fully understand one without the other. The Hyperboreans were said to be Apollo's special people, his priests and servants, who maintained a constant worship of their divine patron. Their entire society was organized around this devotion. They built magnificent temples to Apollo, conducted elaborate rituals in his honor, and lived their lives according to principles he had taught them in the dawn of time. This religious dimension elevated Hyperborea above a simple fantasy of an earthly paradise. It became a spiritual ideal, a place where the divine and mortal worlds intersected in perfect harmony. The Hyperboreans didn't just live in a beautiful land. They lived in a state of grace blessed by direct contact with the divine. Their 1,000-year lifespans weren't just a gift of their perfect climate and lifestyle. They were a sign of divine favour, a reward for their unwavering devotion to Apollo. The ancient Greeks who heard these stories lived in a world very different from our own. Their cities were small by modern standards, their travels limited by the technologies of the time. The edge of the world wasn't an abstract concept, but a real boundary beyond which lay terra incognita, unknown lands that might hold any wonder or terror the imagination could conceive. In this context, Hyperborea served multiple purposes in Greek thought and culture. First, it represented an ideal against which real societies could be measured. When Greek philosophers and poets wanted to criticize the failings of their own society, they could point to the Hyperboreans as an example of how humans could live if they achieved perfect virtue and harmony. The Hyperboreans knew no war, no disease, no poverty, and no injustice. They had solved all the problems that plagued Greek city-states. They had achieved what every Greek lawgiver and philosopher dreamed of creating. Second, Hyperborea provided a theological explanation for natural phenomena that puzzled ancient observers. Where did Apollo go when he left Greece each winter? Why did the sun behave differently in the far north, sometimes shining at midnight during summer and disappearing entirely during winter? The Hyperborean myth offered answers that satisfied both religious sensibility and proto-scientific curiosity. The land beyond the north wind was exempt from normal natural laws because it was touched by divine presence. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Hyperborea embodied the human yearning for transcendence. Every culture has its vision of paradise, a place where the limitations and sufferings of mortal existence are overcome. For the Greeks, Hyperborea was not just a physical location, but a state of being. The Hyperboreans had achieved what every mystery religion and philosophical school promised their followers. They had found the secret to perfect happiness and immortality, or at least its closest approximation in 1,000 years of blissful life. As Greek culture spread throughout the Mediterranean world, following the conquests of Alexander the Great, the legend of Hyperborea travelled with it. Each new culture that encountered the myth added its own interpretations and embellishments. The Romans, inheriting Greek mythology wholesale, incorporated Hyperborea into their own understanding of the world. Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid referenced the blessed northern land in their works, though often with less emphasis on its religious significance and more focus on its role as a poetic symbol of unattainable perfection. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, attempted to compile all available knowledge about Hyperborea in his massive natural history. He approached the subject with the methodical attention to detail that characterized Roman scholarship. According to Pliny, the Hyperboreans lived in a land where the sun rose and set only once a year, creating 6 months of daylight, followed by 6 months of night. Yet somehow this extreme solar pattern didn't affect the eternal spring that blessed their land. Pliny described the Hyperboreans as living in forests and groves, spending their days in celebration and worship. They knew no discord or sickness, and when they finally tired of their long lives, they would crown themselves with flowers and leap from a certain rock into the sea, considering this a blessed end to a blessed existence. This detail about voluntary death adds a philosophical dimension to the myth. Even in paradise, the Hyperboreans retained free will and could choose their own ending when they felt their time had come. The geographical theories about Hyperborea's location evolved as ancient understanding of world geography expanded. Early Greek sources placed it vaguely beyond Scythia, but as knowledge of northern Europe increased, the location shifted. Some writers identified it with Britain, others with Scandinavia, and still others with regions even further north. The Roman writer Pomponius Mela suggested that Hyperborea might be in the far northeast of Asia, beyond the lands of the Scythians and the mysterious Arimaspi, who fought griffins for gold. This geographical flexibility reveals something important about the nature of Hyperborea in ancient thought. It was always elsewhere, always beyond the reach of ordinary travel and exploration. As the boundaries of the known world expanded, Hyperborea retreated further into the margins. It maintained its mystery by remaining forever out of reach, a necessary quality for any true paradise. If someone could simply sail there or march there, it would lose its transcendent quality and become just another foreign land. The climate of Hyperborea presented ancient thinkers with fascinating paradoxes. How could a land so far north enjoy eternal spring? How could the sun shine constantly in a place that should be frozen and dark? Various explanations were proposed. Some suggested that Hyperborea was sheltered by a ring of mountains that blocked the cold winds. Others proposed that it sat at the exact pole of the world, where different physical laws applied. Still others argued that divine intervention suspended natural law in this blessed realm. These attempts to rationalize the impossible reflect the complex relationship between myth and proto-science in ancient thought. The Greeks and Romans didn't simply accept miraculous claims without question. They tried to understand how such things might be possible within their understanding of how the world worked. This intellectual engagement with myth helped preserve and transmit these stories across centuries, as each generation found new meanings and explanations in the old tales. The inhabitants of Hyperborea were described in terms that emphasized their difference from ordinary mortals. They were said to be taller than normal humans, more beautiful, and possessed of perfect health throughout their 1,000-year lives. Their hair was golden like the sun they worshipped, and their voices were naturally musical. When they sang hymns to Apollo, which they did constantly, their harmonies were so perfect that birds would stop to listen, and even the wind would grow quiet. The social structure of Hyperborea fascinated ancient political theorists. Here was a society without kings or rulers, in the conventional sense, yet perfectly ordered and harmonious. The Hyperboreans governed themselves through custom and religious law, with priests of Apollo serving as guides rather than rulers. There were no courts or punishments, because there was no crime. Everyone naturally did what was right because they lived in such close communion with the divine that evil thoughts couldn't take root in their minds. This political perfection made Hyperborea a useful reference point in Greek and Roman political philosophy. When Plato described his ideal republic, when Aristotle analysed different forms of government, when Cicero wrote about natural law, the shadow of Hyperborea lurked in the background. It represented the theoretical possibility of perfect human society, even if such perfection was practically unattainable in the fallen world of ordinary mortals. The economy of Hyperborea, insofar as ancient sources described it, was based on abundance rather than scarcity. The land produced food without cultivation, trees bore fruit year-round, and springs flowed with sweet water that never ran dry. The Hyperboreans had no need for trade or commerce because they had everything they needed. Gold and precious stones were as common as pebbles, valued only for their beauty rather than as currency. This economic paradise eliminated the root causes of conflict and inequality that plagued real societies. Yet the Hyperboreans were not entirely isolated from the outside world. Ancient sources describe various forms of contact between Hyperborea and Greece. The most famous involved sacred offerings that the Hyperboreans sent to Apollo's shrine at Delos. According to Herodotus, these offerings were wrapped in wheat straw and passed from people to people along a sacred route that led from Hyperborea through Scythia, along the Black Sea coast, through Thrace, and finally to Delos. This tradition of sacred offerings provides one of the most intriguing aspects of the Hyperborean myth. It suggests that however remote and inaccessible Hyperborea might be, it maintained some form of contact with the wider world. The offerings were real, physical objects that Greek priests at Delos claimed to receive, though their ultimate origin was impossible to verify. This blend of concrete religious practice and mythical origin gave the Hyperborean legend a unique status between pure myth and historical reality. The route of the sacred offerings also provides clues about how the Greeks imagined the geography of Hyperborea. The path through Scythia and around the Black Sea suggests a location somewhere in the far northeast of the known world, perhaps in what is now Russia or Siberia. Yet the mythical quality of Hyperborea meant it could never be precisely located on any map. It existed in sacred geography rather than physical geography, occupying a space between the real and the ideal. Stories also circulated about individual Hyperboreans who visited Greece. The most famous was Abaris, a legendary sage and healer who supposedly arrived in Greece carrying an arrow of Apollo. This arrow allowed him to travel through the air, crossing vast distances without touching the ground. Abaris was said to have purified cities of plague, predicted earthquakes, and taught the Greeks sacred knowledge from his homeland. His story blends historical and mythical elements in ways that make it impossible to determine whether he was based on a real person or was entirely legendary. Another tradition spoke of Hyperborean maidens who had once travelled to Delos to assist with the birth of Apollo and Artemis. These maidens, named Hyperotia and Laodice in some accounts, died on Delos and were buried there. Their tombs became objects of veneration, and Greek girls would cut their hair as offerings to these Hyperborean virgins before marriage. This cult practice provided another tangible connection between the mythical Hyperborea and the religious life of historical Greece. The artistic culture of Hyperborea was said to centre entirely around the worship of Apollo. Music was their highest art, and every Hyperborean was a skilled singer and musician. They invented new instruments unknown to other peoples, including lyres with strings made from sunbeams and drums that echoed with the voice of thunder. Their songs could heal the sick, calm wild beasts, and even move stones to dance. This musical perfection reflected their spiritual harmony and their close relationship with Apollo, the god of music. The Hyperboreans were also credited with discovering important religious and philosophical truths that they shared with favoured Greeks. Pythagoras was said to have received teachings from Abaris the Hyperborean, including knowledge about the immortality of the soul and the harmony of the spheres. This connection between Hyperborea and Greek philosophy suggests that the mythical northern land served as a source of divine wisdom, a place where truth was clearer because the veil between mortal and divine was thinner. The architecture of Hyperborea, as described in ancient sources, surpassed anything in the mortal world. The temple of Apollo in Hyperborea was said to be circular, made of white stone that glowed with its own inner light. Some accounts described it as floating slightly above the ground, suspended by divine power. The temple was surrounded by groves of trees that bore golden fruit, and swans sacred to Apollo nested in their branches. These swans would sing in harmony with the Hyperborean priests during religious ceremonies. The daily life of ordinary Hyperboreans was characterized by joy and leisure. They spent their time in religious observance, philosophical discussion, athletic contests, and artistic pursuits. They had no need to work in the conventional sense because nature provided everything they needed. Their athletic games were not competitive in the way Greek games were, but rather celebrations of physical perfection and divine grace. Everyone was a winner because the purpose was to honour Apollo through the display of human potential. The role of women in Hyperborean society presents an interesting contrast to Greek social norms. While Greek women were generally excluded from public life and restricted to domestic roles, Hyperborean women were described as full participants in religious and social activities. They served as priestesses, participated in athletic contests, and joined in the philosophical discussions that occupied much of Hyperborean life. This gender equality was another mark of Hyperborean perfection, a society that had transcended the limitations and prejudices of ordinary human cultures. The question of death in Hyperborea reveals profound philosophical implications. While the Hyperboreans lived for 1,000 years, they were not truly immortal. They aged, though very slowly, and eventually chose their time to die. This voluntary death was not seen as tragic, but as a final act of freedom and dignity. By choosing their own end, the Hyperboreans maintained agency even over death itself. They transformed what was elsewhere the ultimate limitation into a final expression of will. Some accounts suggested that death for a Hyperborean was not an ending, but a transformation. After leaping from the sacred cliff, they were said to be transformed into swans or stars, continuing their existence in a different form. This belief connected Hyperborea to broader Greek ideas about the fate of blessed souls after death. The islands of the blessed, the Elysian fields, and Hyperborea all represented variations on the theme of paradise as the reward for a virtuous life. The influence of Hyperborea on Greek religious thought extended beyond the cult of Apollo. The Orphic mysteries, which promised initiates a blessed afterlife, incorporated elements of Hyperborean belief. The idea that humans could achieve a state of divine grace through proper living and religious observance was central to both Hyperborean myth and Orphic teaching. Some scholars have suggested that the Hyperborean myth influenced the development of these mystery religions, providing a model for human transcendence. The physical location of Hyperborea presented ancient geographers with an enduring puzzle that revealed the limits of their world knowledge and the power of their imagination. Unlike other mythical places that existed in clearly supernatural realms, Hyperborea was supposedly part of the physical world, connected to known lands by routes that real people claim to travel. Yet every attempt to precisely locate this blessed land ended in contradiction and mystery. The fundamental geographical premise of Hyperborea was its position beyond the north wind. This poetic description created immediate problems for anyone trying to place it on a map. The north wind, Boreas, was understood to originate from the far north, but how could anything be beyond the source of the north wind? Some ancient thinkers proposed that the world was arranged in circles or bands, with Hyperborea occupying a special zone where different natural laws applied. Others suggested that massive mountains blocked the wind, creating a pocket of calm beyond them. Herodotus, with his characteristic skepticism, noted the logical problems with placing Hyperborea in the far north. He observed that the Scythians, who lived in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, already experienced winters so harsh that the ground was frozen for 8 months of the year. How could a land of eternal spring exist even further north? His doubt reflects the tension between mythical tradition and empirical observation that characterized Greek intellectual life. Yet the tradition was too strong to dismiss entirely. Various ancient authorities attempted to reconcile the mythical Hyperborea with geographical reality. Hecataeus of Abdera, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, placed Hyperborea on an island in the ocean, beyond Gaul, roughly the size of Sicily. He described this island as having a spherical temple to Apollo, which some modern scholars have interpreted as a reference to Stonehenge, though this connection remains highly speculative. The Roman writer Pomponius Mela offered a different solution. He suggested that Hyperborea was located at the very axis of the world, the point around which the heavens rotated. At this special location, the sun would indeed behave differently than elsewhere, rising and setting only once per year. This explanation attempted to use astronomical theory to justify the mythical attributes of Hyperborea, showing how ancient thinkers tried to rationalize wonderful stories within their understanding of natural philosophy. Mountains played a crucial role in most ancient descriptions of Hyperborean geography. The Rhipaean Mountains, mentioned by numerous classical authors, were said to form an impassable barrier between the known world and Hyperborea. These mountains were impossibly tall, their peaks lost in the clouds, their passes blocked by eternal snow and guarded by fierce griffins. The mountains served both a practical and symbolic function in the myth. Practically, they explained why no one could simply walk to Hyperborea. Symbolically, they represented the barrier between the mortal and divine worlds. Different authors placed these guardian mountains in different locations as geographical knowledge expanded. Early sources put them just north of Scythia. Later writers pushed them further north and east into the unexplored regions of what is now Siberia. The flexibility of their location reveals how Hyperborea functioned as a moving horizon, always retreating beyond the edge of the known world. As explorers and traders pushed into new regions, Hyperborea retreated before them like a mirage. The climate paradox of Hyperborea fascinated ancient natural philosophers. How could a northern land enjoy eternal spring? Various explanations were proposed, each revealing something about ancient understanding of climate and geography. Some suggested that Hyperborea was heated by underground fires, volcanic activity that warmed the soil and air. Others proposed that the land was blessed by divine intervention, with Apollo's presence suspending natural law. Still others argued that the extreme north might curve back toward warmth, following a logic we now know to be false, but which seemed plausible given limited ancient knowledge of global geography. Rivers featured prominently in descriptions of Hyperborean geography. The mythical Eridanus River, sometimes identified with the Po in Italy or the Rhine in Germany, was said to flow from Hyperborea carrying amber, which the Greeks called electron. This connection between Hyperborea and the amber trade routes of northern Europe provided a tantalizing link between myth and commercial reality. Baltic amber did reach the Mediterranean through long trade routes, and its mysterious northern origin contributed to Hyperborean legends. The ocean surrounding Hyperborea was described in terms that emphasized its otherworldly nature. Some accounts called it the Frozen Sea or the Dead Sea, not in reference to the body of water we know by that name today, but meaning a sea where nothing could live. Others described it as the Milk Sea, white and thick, impossible for normal ships to navigate. These descriptions might preserve genuine accounts of Arctic ice conditions, transformed through retelling into mythical obstacles. Pliny the Elder attempted a more systematic geography of the far north, including Hyperborea. He described a 6-month day followed by a 6-month night, which accurately describes conditions at the pole. He placed Hyperborea at the point where this extreme solar pattern occurred, suggesting a location at or near the Arctic Circle. Yet he also insisted that this land enjoyed a temperate climate and produced 2 harvests per year, contradictions he acknowledged but couldn't resolve. The relationship between Hyperborea and other mythical northern lands added layers of complexity to its geography. Thule, described by the explorer Pytheas in the 4th century before the Common Era, was sometimes identified with Hyperborea, sometimes distinguished from it. Thule was supposedly 6 days' sail north of Britain, a land where the sun never set in summer and never rose in winter. Whether Pytheas actually reached Iceland, Norway, or some other northern land remains debated, but his account influenced all subsequent discussions of far northern geography. The concept of the Fortunate Isles, or islands of the blessed sometimes overlapped with Hyperborea in ancient thought. These blessed lands were usually placed in the Western Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. But some authors suggested they might be the same as Hyperborea, reached by different routes. This confusion of blessed lands reflects the human tendency to project paradise onto unknown regions of the map, whether north, west, or any other direction beyond immediate experience. Maps from the ancient world rarely attempted to show Hyperborea, and when they did, its placement was highly variable. The Tabula Peutingeriana, a Roman map that survives in medieval copies, shows the known world but leaves the far north blank. Other maps from antiquity that mentioned Hyperborea placed it symbolically rather than geographically, often as a decorative element representing the limits of the world rather than a real location to be reached. The fauna of Hyperborea, as described in ancient sources, combined real northern animals with mythical creatures. Swans, sacred to Apollo, were the most commonly mentioned animals, said to sing more beautifully than swans elsewhere. White bears, possibly based on genuine accounts of polar bears, were sometimes mentioned. But there were also griffins guarding mountain passes, and in some accounts, people who had the heads of dogs or feet turned backward. These monstrous races at the borders of Hyperborea served to emphasize its separation from the normal world. The flora of Hyperborea was equally wonderful. Trees bore fruit throughout the year, never losing their leaves despite the northern location. Grains grew wild without cultivation, and vines produced grapes sweeter than any found in Greece or Italy. Some accounts mention plants unknown elsewhere, herbs that could cure any disease and flowers that glowed with their own light. This botanical paradise reflected the general perfection of Hyperborea, while also suggesting lost knowledge of medicinal plants that might exist in unexplored regions. Ancient attempts to calculate the size of Hyperborea varied wildly. Some described it as a small island, others as a vast continent larger than Asia. Hecataeus claimed it was about the size of Sicily, while other authors suggested it stretched from one side of the world to the other. These variations reflect the fact that Hyperborea existed more as a concept than a place, its size expanding or contracting based on the needs of the narrative rather than any consistent geography. The accessibility of Hyperborea was a constant theme in ancient discussions. While the land itself was unreachable by ordinary mortals, various forms of indirect contact were possible. The sacred offerings sent to Delos demonstrated that some form of communication existed. Individual Hyperboreans like Abaris could leave their homeland, though they required divine assistance to do so, and certain heroes or sages might be granted access to Hyperborea as a reward for exceptional virtue or service to the gods. The tradition of the Hyperborean offerings to Delos provides some of the most concrete geographical information about supposed routes to Hyperborea. Herodotus traced the route in detail, from Hyperborea to the Scythians, from the Scythians to the Adriatic, down the Adriatic to Dodona, across Greece to the Malian Gulf, through Euboea to Tenos, and finally to Delos. This specific itinerary suggests that whatever the ultimate origin of these offerings, they followed real trade routes that connected the Greek world with northern Europe. Some ancient authors attempted to explain Hyperborea in terms of actual northern peoples and places. The Isidones mentioned by Herodotus as living northeast of Scythia were sometimes identified as neighbours of the Hyperboreans. The Arimaspi, one-eyed people who fought griffins for gold, were placed between Scythia and Hyperborea. These peoples might preserve garbled accounts of real Central Asian or Siberian tribes, their strange customs exaggerated through retelling into mythical attributes. The question of whether anyone had actually reached Hyperborea was debated in antiquity. Aristias of Proconnesus, a semi-legendary figure from the 7th century before the Common Era, claimed to have travelled to the land of the Isidones while possessed by Apollo. He wrote a poem called the Arimaspeia about his journey, though it survives only in fragments. His account influenced later descriptions of the far north, blending shamanic vision with geographical exploration in ways that make it impossible to separate fact from fiction. The Roman period brought new attempts to rationalize Hyperborean geography. As Roman legions pushed into Germany and Britain, and Roman traders reached Scandinavia and the Baltic, the possible locations for Hyperborea shifted. Some identified it with Scandinavia, others with Britain, still others with legendary islands in the North Atlantic. The Roman encyclopedist Solinus collected various traditions about Hyperborea, noting the contradictions but unable to resolve them into a coherent geography. The medieval period would bring new interpretations of Hyperborean geography, as Christian scholars tried to reconcile pagan myths with biblical history and emerging knowledge of world geography. Some placed Hyperborea near the earthly paradise, others identified it with the land of Gog and Magog mentioned in Scripture. The flexibility of Hyperborean geography allowed it to be continuously reinterpreted while maintaining its essential character as a blessed land beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. The daily existence of the Hyperboreans represented everything that ancient philosophers and poets imagined a perfect human life could be. Free from want, disease, conflict, and even the fear of death, they lived in a state of perpetual celebration and spiritual fulfillment that served as both an inspiration and a reproach to the struggling societies of Greece and Rome. Their lifestyle wasn't merely comfortable or pleasant, but transcendent, a complete realization of human potential, unencumbered by the limitations that defined mortal existence elsewhere. Morning in Hyperborea began not with the crow of roosters or the bustle of workers heading to fields and workshops, but with music. As the eternal sun cast its golden light across the blessed land, the Hyperboreans would gather in sacred groves to sing hymns to Apollo. These weren't hurried prayers squeezed between the demands of daily labour, but elaborate performances that could last for hours. Every Hyperborean possessed a voice of extraordinary beauty, trained from childhood in the complex harmonies of their sacred music. When hundreds or thousands joined together in song, the sound was said to be so beautiful that the very trees would sway in rhythm, and birds would fall silent to listen. After the morning devotions, the Hyperboreans would turn to their various pursuits, though the word work hardly describes their activities. They had no agriculture in the conventional sense because their land produced food spontaneously. Fruits grew wild on trees that never knew winter, grain sprouted from untilled soil, and clear springs provided water sweeter than wine. The gathering of this bounty was more like a pleasant walk through a garden than labour. Groups of friends would wander through forests and meadows, filling baskets with whatever appealed to them, singing and conversing as they went. The social structure of Hyperborea fascinated ancient political theorists because it seemed to function without any of the mechanisms that other societies required. There were no kings, no judges, no soldiers, and no police. Yet perfect order prevailed. The Hyperboreans governed themselves through custom and unanimous consent, guided by priests who served more as teachers and advisors than rulers. When decisions needed to be made affecting the whole community, they would gather in their circular temple and discuss until everyone agreed. This might seem impossible to achieve, but the Hyperboreans were said to be so aligned in their values and desires that disagreement rarely arose. The absence of private property in the conventional sense removed one of the primary sources of conflict in human societies. While Hyperboreans had personal possessions like clothing and musical instruments, land and resources belonged to all. No one could hoard wealth because wealth in the material sense had no meaning in a land where everything was abundant. Gold and jewels were valued only for their beauty, used to decorate temples and public spaces rather than hoarded in private treasuries. This economic arrangement eliminated envy, greed, and the 1,000 conflicts that arise from inequality. The education of young Hyperboreans began almost from birth, though education might be too formal a word for what was essentially a joyful initiation into their culture. Children learned by participating in the constant religious and artistic activities of their elders. They were taught to sing before they could properly walk, to play instruments as naturally as they learned to speak. Mathematics and geometry were studied not as abstract disciplines, but as ways to understand the divine harmony that undergirded existence. Philosophy was not an academic subject, but a living practice woven into daily conversation and contemplation. Physical culture in Hyperborea achieved a perfection unknown in even the most athletic Greek cities. The Hyperboreans engaged in sports and exercises not for competition, but for the joy of movement and the cultivation of bodily perfection as an offering to Apollo. Their athletic contests were exhibitions of grace and skill rather than struggles for victory. Everyone participated according to their ability, from the youngest children to elders centuries old who retained much of their youthful vigour. Swimming in sacred lakes, running through flower-filled meadows, dancing in elaborate patterns that mirrored the movement of celestial bodies. All these activities combined physical exercise with spiritual practice. The architecture of Hyperborean settlements reflected their unique relationship with both nature and the divine. They built no fortifications because they had no enemies. Their homes were described as pavilions of white stone that seemed to grow from the earth rather than being constructed upon it. These buildings were open to the eternal spring air, with gardens and living spaces flowing together without sharp boundaries. Public buildings were more elaborate, especially the temples, which were said to be made of materials unknown elsewhere, stones that captured and reflected light, metals that sang when the wind touched them. The role of art in Hyperborean society went far beyond decoration or entertainment. Every Hyperborean was an artist in some medium, whether music, poetry, dance, or visual arts. They created not for fame or profit, but as a form of worship and self-expression. Their artworks were offerings to Apollo and gifts to their community. Sculptures were placed in public spaces for all to enjoy, poems were recited at communal gatherings, and new songs were taught to anyone who wished to learn them. This universal artistic participation created a society where beauty was not a luxury, but a constant presence in daily life. The Hyperborean approach to medicine and healing demonstrated their different relationship with physical existence. They suffered no diseases in the conventional sense, but they had an elaborate tradition of preventive care and spiritual healing. Their healers were more like counselors or spiritual guides than physicians, helping individuals maintain the perfect balance of body and soul that was their birthright. They used music as medicine, believing that different melodies could adjust the harmonies of the human body. They prescribed specific songs for melancholy, others for excessive excitement, and still others to enhance clarity of thought. Herbs and plants were used not to cure illness, but to enhance already perfect health, to sharpen the senses or induce prophetic dreams. The concept of family in Hyperborea differed significantly from Greek and Roman models. While they formed pair bonds and raised children, the entire community functioned as an extended family. Children were treasured by all, not just their biological parents. Elders were revered for their wisdom accumulated over centuries of life. There was no generational conflict because each age of life was valued for its unique contributions. The young brought energy and innovation, the middle-aged provided stability and skill, and the elders offered wisdom and connection to tradition. Marriage among the Hyperboreans was described as a spiritual union blessed by Apollo himself. These unions were said to last for centuries, with couples growing ever closer rather than apart over their extended lives. Divorce was unknown, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unnecessary. The same harmony that characterized their society as a whole extended to their personal relationships. Some accounts suggested that Hyperboreans could read each other's thoughts, or at least emotions, making deception and betrayal impossible. The treatment of animals in Hyperborea reflected their general harmony with nature. They kept no livestock because they had no need for meat or milk, subsisting entirely on the fruits and grains their land provided freely. Wild animals showed no fear of them, and they could walk among deer and birds as friends rather than predators. The sacred swans of Apollo were their special companions, said to understand human speech and to carry messages between different parts of their land. This peaceful coexistence with nature was another mark of their blessed state. Their festivals and celebrations were legendary even among the Greeks, who were no strangers to elaborate religious ceremonies. The Hyperboreans celebrated not just seasonal festivals, but daily ones, finding reasons for joy and thanksgiving in every aspect of existence. Their greatest festival was the return of Apollo from his winter sojourn in their land. Though since he was always present in Hyperborea, this might have been a symbolic celebration rather than a literal arrival. During these festivals, the entire population would gather for days of singing, dancing, feasting, and philosophical discussion. The food culture of Hyperborea, despite the absence of agriculture or cooking in the conventional sense, was remarkably sophisticated. They prepared elaborate feasts from the natural bounty of their land, creating dishes that were as much art as nourishment. Fruits were arranged in complex patterns that told stories or represented philosophical concepts. Waters from different springs were mixed to create beverages with subtle flavours. They had no wine in the Greek sense, but they created intoxicating drinks from honey and flowers that induced states of spiritual ecstasy rather than drunkenness. The Hyperborean attitude toward time was fundamentally different from that of ordinary mortals. Living for 1,000 years, they had no need to rush or to fear that time was running out. They could spend decades perfecting a single song or poem, centuries developing a philosophical idea. This temporal luxury allowed them to achieve levels of mastery impossible for shorter-lived peoples. A Hyperborean musician might practice a single instrument for longer than entire human civilizations lasted, achieving a skill that seemed supernatural to outside observers. Their libraries and centres of learning were said to contain wisdom accumulated over millennia. Unlike human libraries that struggled to preserve knowledge against the ravages of time, Hyperborean learning was passed down through living memory as much as written records. Elders who had lived for centuries could recall events that elsewhere would be lost to myth. They preserved not just information, but understanding, the context and wisdom that gave facts meaning. Some accounts claimed that all human knowledge originally came from Hyperborea, carried to the outside world by visitors like Abaris. The justice system of Hyperborea, to the extent that it existed, operated on principles of restoration rather than punishment. Crime was virtually unknown, but when someone did act against community harmony, the response was to understand why and to heal whatever imbalance had caused the behaviour. There were no prisons, no executions, no exile. The community would gather to help the individual return to harmony, using music, conversation, and spiritual practices. This approach assumed that antisocial behaviour was a form of illness rather than evil, a temporary departure from the natural state of Hyperborean perfection. Trade and commerce, as understood by other civilizations, didn't exist in Hyperborea. They had no money, no markets, no merchants, Everything was shared freely among the community. If someone needed something, they simply took it from common stores or asked whoever had it. This might seem like it would lead to shortages or conflicts, but in a land of infinite abundance inhabited by people without greed, such problems never arose. The only trade they engaged in was the sending of sacred offerings to Apollo's shrines in the outside world, and this was a religious duty rather than commerce. The crafts and manufacturing of Hyperborea achieved levels of perfection that seemed magical to outside observers. Their weavers created cloth so fine they seemed to be made of light itself. Their metalworkers, despite having no need for weapons or tools, in the conventional sense, created ornaments and ritual objects of extraordinary beauty. They worked with materials unknown elsewhere, including metals that never tarnished and stones that glowed with inner light. These crafts were practiced not out of necessity, but as forms of artistic and spiritual expression. Communication in Hyperborea transcended ordinary language. While they spoke and sang in their own tongue, which some claimed was the original language from which all others descended, they also communicated through music, dance, and even silence. A gesture could convey complex philosophical ideas. A melody could tell an entire story. This rich, multi-layered communication allowed for expressions of thought and feeling impossible in ordinary human discourse. When Hyperboreans like Abaris visited the outside world, they often struggled to convey their knowledge through the crude medium of normal language. The role of dreams and visions in Hyperborean life was central to their spiritual practice. They believed that in sleep the soul could travel freely, visiting other lands and even other planes of existence. Their priests were trained in the interpretation of dreams and in techniques for inducing prophetic visions. Some accounts suggested that the Hyperboreans could share dreams, entering each other's sleeping minds to communicate or experience together. This dream culture provided another level of community bonding and spiritual exploration. Privacy as understood by individualistic cultures had little meaning in Hyperborea. They lived communally, not out of necessity but choice, enjoying each other's company constantly. Their homes had no locks, their lives no secrets. This might seem oppressive to modern sensibilities, but for the Hyperboreans it was liberating. Without shame, guilt, or fear of judgment, they had no need to hide anything. Their thoughts and actions were as open as their homes, creating a transparency that made deception impossible and trust absolute. The treatment of visitors to Hyperborea, on the rare occasions when outsiders were permitted to enter, demonstrated their extraordinary hospitality. Guests were treated as sacred, blessed by Apollo for being chosen to witness Hyperborean life. They were given the finest foods, taught sacred songs, and shown wonders that existed nowhere else. Yet visitors could never stay permanently. The perfection of Hyperborea was for the Hyperboreans alone, a birthright that couldn't be acquired but only inherited. This exclusivity wasn't cruel but necessary, preserving the unique nature of their blessed existence. Children in Hyperborea grew up in an environment of absolute security and love. They had no fear of harm, no experience of want, no exposure to conflict or cruelty. Their play was creative and elaborate, often involving complex games that could last for months or years. They were never punished in the conventional sense because they rarely misbehaved, and when they did, gentle correction was sufficient. This childhood paradise produced adults who retained a childlike joy and wonder throughout their 1,000-year lives. The relationship between work and leisure in Hyperborea challenges modern assumptions about human motivation. Without the need to work for survival, one might expect the Hyperboreans to become lazy or purposeless. Instead, they were constantly active, always creating, learning, and celebrating. They demonstrated that humans, freed from necessity, don't become idle but instead pursue higher forms of activity. Their work was what we would call art, philosophy, and spiritual practice, activities that were simultaneously productive and enjoyable. Death, when it finally came to a Hyperborean after 1,000 years of life, was not feared but welcomed as a natural transition. They prepared for death as they might prepare for a journey, saying farewells, completing unfinished works, passing on knowledge to younger generations. The actual moment of death was chosen consciously, usually by leaping from a sacred cliff into the sea, while crowned with flowers. This wasn't suicide in the modern sense, but a final act of autonomy, choosing the moment of transition when life had been fully lived. The funeral practices of Hyperborea reflected their unique attitude toward death. There was no mourning in the conventional sense because death wasn't seen as tragic. Instead, they celebrated the completed life with festivals that could last for weeks. The deceased were remembered through songs and stories that preserved not just their deeds, but their essence. Some accounts suggested that the spirits of dead Hyperboreans remained present in some form, continuing to participate in the community's spiritual life. The spiritual life of Hyperborea formed the absolute centre of their existence, with every aspect of their society flowing from their profound connection to Apollo and the divine realm. Unlike other ancient cultures, where religion was one element among many, the Hyperboreans lived in a state of constant worship, their entire civilization functioning as a living temple to their patron deity. This total integration of the sacred and secular, if such a distinction even existed for them, created a society where spiritual practice wasn't separate from daily life, but identical with it. Apollo's presence in Hyperborea was not abstract or distant, but immediate and tangible. While the Greeks knew Apollo through his temples and oracles, receiving his wisdom filtered through priests and prophecies, the Hyperboreans enjoyed direct communion with their god. He walked among them in physical form during his winter sojourns, taught them personally, and participated in their celebrations. This immediate divine presence eliminated the doubt and uncertainty that plagued religious practice elsewhere. The Hyperboreans didn't believe in Apollo. They knew him as surely as they knew each other. The temple of Apollo in Hyperborea surpassed all other sacred structures in the ancient world, not just in size and beauty, but in its fundamental nature. Described as perfectly circular, representing the divine perfection of the sphere, it was said to be constructed from materials that existed nowhere else on Earth. The walls were made of white stone that glowed with its own inner light, never needing torches or candles. The roof was transparent crystal that amplified the eternal sunlight, creating rainbow patterns that shifted throughout the day. Some accounts claimed the temple could rotate, aligning itself with celestial movements to maintain perfect harmony with the cosmos. Within this temple, the Hyperboreans conducted rituals unlike anything practiced in the outside world. Their ceremonies lasted not hours but days, even weeks, with participants entering altered states of consciousness through music, dance, and meditation. They didn't sacrifice animals as the Greeks did, having no need to appease or bargain with their god. Instead, they offered songs, poems, dances, and philosophical insights. Every new artistic creation, every breakthrough in understanding, was dedicated to Apollo. The temple resonated constantly with music, as shifts of priests maintained an eternal hymn that had supposedly been sung without interruption since the beginning of time. The priesthood of Hyperborea included every adult member of society, for all Hyperboreans were considered sacred servants of Apollo. However, there were those who dedicated themselves more completely to religious practice, spending decades or centuries in contemplation and ritual. These high priests and priestesses were said to possess abilities that seemed miraculous to outsiders. They could heal with a touch, see the future in dreams, and communicate directly with Apollo. Some accounts claimed they could levitate, become invisible, or project their consciousness across vast distances. The sacred calendar of Hyperborea structured their entire existence around religious observance. Every day had its specific rituals and celebrations, every month its festivals, every year its grand ceremonies. Yet this wasn't experienced as repetitive or burdensome because each celebration was unique, incorporating new songs, new insights, new expressions of devotion. The Hyperboreans had been celebrating for millennia without exhausting their creativity or enthusiasm. Their religious practice was constantly evolving while maintaining an unbroken connection to ancient tradition. Music held a special place in Hyperborean spirituality, being considered the most direct form of communication with the divine. They believed that the universe itself was structured according to musical principles, with the movements of stars and planets creating a cosmic harmony that could be perceived by those with proper training. Hyperborean music theory was said to be incredibly sophisticated, incorporating mathematical relationships that revealed the hidden structure of reality. Their songs could allegedly influence natural phenomena, calming storms, encouraging plant growth, or inducing healing trances. The role of prophecy and divination in Hyperborea differed from practices elsewhere because of their unique relationship with time and divine knowledge. While Greek oracles spoke in riddles and ambiguities, Hyperborean prophets were said to see the future with perfect clarity. This wasn't because they were more skilled, but because they lived partially outside normal time, their 1,000-year lifespans giving them a different perspective on causality and change. Some accounts suggested that Hyperboreans could remember the future as clearly as the past, experiencing time as a complete whole rather than a linear sequence. Sacred geometry played a crucial role in Hyperborean religious practice. They believed that certain shapes and proportions were inherently divine, containing spiritual power that could be activated through proper use. Their temple was built according to these principles, its dimensions corresponding to cosmic ratios. They created elaborate geometric patterns in their rituals, with dancers moving in formations that traced sacred shapes. These patterns were said to create channels for divine energy, allowing Apollo's power to flow more freely into the physical world. The Hyperborean understanding of the soul was more sophisticated than contemporary Greek philosophy. They believed in a complex spiritual anatomy, with multiple aspects of the soul serving different functions. The physical soul animated the body, the emotional soul experienced feelings, the intellectual soul engaged in thought, and the divine soul connected to Apollo and the cosmic order. Their 1,000-year lifespan was attributed to perfect harmony among these soul components, while death came when someone consciously chose to release the bonds holding them together. Initiation rituals in Hyperborea marked important spiritual transitions rather than social ones. Young Hyperboreans underwent a series of initiations throughout their extended youth, each one revealing deeper levels of spiritual knowledge. These weren't tests to be passed or failed, but experiences to be absorbed, each individual progressing at their own pace. The final initiation, undertaken after centuries of preparation, was said to grant complete understanding of divine mysteries. Those who achieved this level could perform miracles and were considered living bridges between mortal and divine realms. The concept of sin or spiritual pollution was almost unknown in Hyperborea. Living in constant divine presence and perfect harmony, they had no capacity for evil in the conventional sense. When someone did act against divine order, it was seen as a form of illness rather than moral failure. The response was healing rather than punishment, using music, meditation, and counseling to restore spiritual balance. This approach assumed that all beings naturally sought harmony, and that discord arose only from misunderstanding or imbalance. The Hyperboreans practiced a form of meditation that allowed them to directly perceive divine reality. By quieting their minds and attuning themselves to cosmic harmonies, they could see beyond physical appearance to underlying spiritual truth. In these states, they claimed to communicate not just with Apollo, but with the essential consciousness of the universe itself. This practice required years of training to master, but even beginners could experience glimpses of transcendent awareness that transformed their understanding of existence. Their sacred texts, if they could be called that, were not written books but living traditions maintained through perfect memory and constant practice. The Hyperboreans possessed hymns and stories that had been passed down, unchanged for millennia, preserved not through writing but through continuous recitation. Every Hyperborean knew these traditions by heart, could recite vast epics without error, and understood the deep meanings encoded in ancient words. This oral tradition was considered superior to writing because it remained alive, interpreted and reinterpreted by each generation while maintaining its essential truth. The role of sacred plants and substances in Hyperborean religion remains one of the most mysterious aspects of their practice. Some accounts mention flowers that bloomed only in Hyperborea, whose fragrance could induce prophetic visions. Others speak of waters from certain springs that granted temporary immortality or allowed communication with the dead. These substances were not drugs in the conventional sense, but natural manifestations of divine power, available only in the blessed land where normal natural laws were suspended. The Hyperborean understanding of death and afterlife was complex and unique. They believed that death was not an ending but a transformation, with the soul continuing in different forms. Some souls became stars, others were reborn as swans, and the most elevated merged completely with Apollo's divine essence. This wasn't reincarnation, as understood in Eastern philosophy, but a continuation of existence at different levels of reality. The 1,000-year lifespan of Hyperboreans was seen as preparation for this transformation, allowing the soul to fully develop before moving to its next phase. Animal sacrifice, central to Greek and Roman religion, was completely absent from Hyperborean practice. They considered the killing of animals for religious purposes to be barbaric and unnecessary. Their offerings to Apollo consisted of songs, dances, flowers, and artistic creations. They believed that the god desired beauty and harmony, not blood and death. This bloodless worship influenced certain Greek philosophical schools, particularly the Pythagoreans, who adopted vegetarianism and opposed animal sacrifice based partly on Hyperborean example. The connection between Hyperborea and other mystery religions of the ancient world was complex and significant. The Orphic mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, and various other esoteric traditions claim to preserve Hyperborean wisdom. These religions promised initiates a blessed afterlife, similar to the earthly paradise of Hyperborea. Some taught that exceptional souls could be reborn in Hyperborea as a reward for spiritual achievement. This influence spread throughout the Hellenistic world, shaping religious thought far beyond Greece. Dreams and visions played a central role in Hyperborean religious practice. They believed that in sleep, the soul could travel freely through spiritual realms, receiving direct teaching from Apollo and other divine beings. Their priests were expert dream interpreters, able to decode the symbolic language of the unconscious mind. They also practiced induced dreaming, using techniques to direct their dreams toward specific spiritual goals. Some accounts claim they could enter each other's dreams, creating shared visionary experiences that strengthened community bonds. The Hyperborean concept of sacred time differed radically from ordinary temporal experience. During religious ceremonies, time was said to stop or stretch, allowing participants to experience eternity within moments. This temporal flexibility was considered one of Apollo's gifts to his chosen people, freeing them from the tyranny of linear time that constrained other mortals. Their ability to live for 1,000 years was just one manifestation of this different relationship with time. Sacred mathematics formed another cornerstone of Hyperborean spirituality. They believed that numbers were not human inventions, but divine principles that structured reality. Certain numbers held special power: 3 for completeness, 7 for perfection, 12 for cosmic order. Their religious ceremonies were organized according to numerical principles with specific numbers of participants, repetitions, and ritual elements. This mathematical mysticism influenced Pythagorean philosophy and, through it, much of Western esoteric tradition. The practice of sacred dance in Hyperborea went far beyond entertainment or exercise. Their dances were forms of moving meditation, each gesture carrying spiritual significance. Dancers would train for decades to perfect a single movement, achieving a precision that seemed superhuman. Group dances could involve hundreds of participants moving in perfect synchronization without any visible communication. These performances were said to create geometric patterns visible from above, spelling out prayers or philosophical principles in the language of movement. The Hyperborean approach to healing integrated physical, mental, and spiritual dimensions. Their healers were simultaneously physicians, psychologists, and priests. They used music to restore bodily harmony, conversation to heal emotional wounds, and ritual to repair spiritual damage. Disease was understood as discord between the individual and cosmic order, treatable only by addressing all levels of being. This holistic approach influenced Greek medical theory, particularly the idea of health as balance among various forces. Among all the legendary figures associated with Hyperborea, none captured the ancient imagination quite like Abaris the Hyperborean, a mysterious sage who supposedly travelled from the blessed northern land to Greece carrying Apollo's golden arrow. His story blends historical accounts with mythical elements in ways that make it impossible to determine whether he was based on a real person or was entirely legendary. Yet his influence on Greek philosophy and religion was profound and lasting, making him one of the most important cultural bridges between the mythical Hyperborea and the historical Mediterranean world. Abaris appeared in Greece during the 6th century, before the Common Era, though different sources place his arrival at different times. He came as an ambassador from his people, carrying greetings from Hyperborea to Apollo's shrines in the Greek world. But he was no ordinary diplomat. Abaris possessed abilities that amazed even the Greeks, who were accustomed to wandering prophets and miracle workers. He could travel through the air on Apollo's arrow, crossing vast distances without touching the ground. He could go without food for extended periods, sustained by spiritual energy alone. He could cure diseases with a touch, predict earthquakes, and stop plagues. The arrow of Apollo that Abaris carried was more than a symbol of divine favour. It was described as a magical object that granted its bearer extraordinary powers. Some accounts said it was the same arrow Apollo had used to slay the python at Delphi, others that it was forged in Hyperborea from sunlight and divine metal. Abaris could ride upon it like a vehicle, travelling faster than the wind. He could use it to purify cities of spiritual pollution, pointing it at sources of evil and destroying them with divine light. The arrow also served as a badge of authority, proving his status as Apollo's chosen messenger. Abaris's meeting with Pythagoras became one of the most celebrated encounters in ancient philosophical tradition. The two sages recognized each other as kindred spirits, both dedicated to understanding divine truth through mathematics and spiritual practice. Abaris was said to have taught Pythagoras secrets of Hyperborean wisdom, including doctrines about the immortality of the soul and the harmony of the spheres. In return, Pythagoras shared his own insights, creating an exchange of knowledge that enriched both traditions. Some accounts even claimed that Pythagoras showed Abaris his golden thigh, proving that he was Apollo incarnate, though this detail might be later embellishment. The healing missions of Abaris took him throughout the Greek world. He purified Sparta when it was struck by plague, performing rituals that ended the disease overnight. He cleansed Athens of spiritual pollution caused by ancient crimes, allowing the city to prosper. In Crete, he established new religious practices that combined Hyperborean wisdom with local traditions. Everywhere he went, he left behind disciples who continued his teachings, creating a network of Hyperborean influence throughout Greece. Beyond Abaris, other Hyperborean figures appear in Greek legend, though none achieved his fame. Hyperoche and Laodice were Hyperborean maidens who travelled to Delos to assist with the birth of Apollo and Artemis. They died on the island and were buried there, becoming objects of veneration. Greek girls would cut their hair as offerings to these Hyperborean virgins before marriage, maintaining a ritual connection between Greece and the far north. The tombs of these maidens became pilgrimage sites, places where the boundary between the mortal and divine worlds was particularly thin. Another pair of Hyperborean maidens, Arge and Opis, had come to Delos even earlier, accompanying the sacred offerings from their homeland. They too died on the island and received divine honours. Some versions of the story suggested that these maidens had voluntarily sacrificed themselves to consecrate the island to Apollo, their Hyperborean blood making the ground sacred. Their cult continued for centuries, with special hymns sung in their honour during religious festivals. The figure of Olin, a legendary Hyperborean poet, was credited with composing the first hymns to Apollo. He was said to have established the oracle at Delphi, teaching the priestesses the art of prophecy. The hexameter verse used in oracular pronouncements was supposedly his invention, a gift from Hyperborea to the Greek world. Some ancient sources claimed that all Greek religious poetry ultimately derived from Olin's Hyperborean originals, though no authentic works survived under his name. Aristocles of Cyrene wrote about meeting a Hyperborean named Cleomedes who possessed extraordinary abilities. This Cleomedes could make himself invisible, walk through walls, and appear in multiple places simultaneously. He claimed these powers came from Hyperborean training in controlling the spiritual body, techniques unknown in the outside world. Cleomedes eventually vanished without a trace, supposedly returning to his homeland, though some claimed he had transcended physical existence entirely. The tradition speaks of Hyperborean priests who visited Delphi every 19 years, corresponding to the Metonic cycle when solar and lunar calendars align. These visits were times of great celebration, with the Hyperborean delegates bringing gifts and receiving honours. They would perform their native music in the temple, songs so beautiful that listeners would weep with joy. These periodic visits maintained the connection between Hyperborea and Greece, reminding the Greeks that the perfect world of the north was not just myth but reality. Individual Hyperboreans were sometimes credited with founding Greek cities or establishing important institutions. The city of Megalopolis in Arcadia claimed a Hyperborean founder who had chosen the site based on divine guidance. Several Greek temples claimed to possess architectural plans provided by Hyperborean builders, explaining their exceptional beauty and acoustic properties. These foundation myths gave Greek institutions legitimacy by connecting them to the blessed northern land. The character of Hyperborean visitors, as described in ancient sources, was remarkably consistent. They were tall, beautiful, with golden hair and melodious voices. They possessed perfect health and seemed ageless, though not immortal when outside their homeland. They were gentle and peaceful, never showing anger or violence even when provoked. Their wisdom was profound but often difficult for ordinary people to understand, expressed in paradoxes and symbols rather than straightforward statements. They had difficulty with common activities like eating normal food or engaging in commerce, as if the corrupted world outside Hyperborea was physically uncomfortable for them. Some accounts mention Hyperborean women who married Greek heroes, bringing divine blood into human lineages. These marriages never lasted long, as the Hyperborean wives would eventually pine for their homeland and either die of longing or find ways to return. Their children, however, would inherit some Hyperborean characteristics: exceptional beauty, musical talent, prophetic abilities, or extended lifespans. Several prominent Greek families claimed Hyperborean ancestry, using it to explain their special talents or political authority. The knowledge that Hyperborean visitors brought to Greece covered diverse fields. They introduced new musical instruments and compositional techniques that revolutionized Greek music. They taught advanced mathematics, including concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered until much later. They shared medical knowledge, particularly the use of music and meditation in healing. They revealed philosophical truths about the nature of reality, the soul, and the divine. This wisdom was never given freely to everyone, but only to those deemed worthy through spiritual preparation. The question of why Hyperboreans would leave their perfect homeland to visit the imperfect outside world was addressed in various ways. Some sources suggested they came as missionaries, sharing divine knowledge to help humanity evolve spiritually. Others claimed they were following Apollo's commands, maintaining connections between his various shrines. Still others proposed that even Hyperboreans needed challenges and new experiences, finding in the outside world opportunities for growth unavailable in their static paradise. The influence of Hyperborean visitors on Greek mystery religions was profound. The Orphic mysteries claimed to preserve teachings brought by Abaris about the soul's journey after death. The Pythagorean Brotherhood incorporated Hyperborean practices of communal living, vegetarianism, and musical meditation. Even the Eleusinian mysteries, though primarily associated with Demeter and Persephone, showed Hyperborean influence in their promise of blessed afterlife for initiates. Stories circulated about Greeks who tried to follow Hyperborean visitors back to their homeland. These attempts always failed, with the travellers either dying in the frozen wastes beyond Scythia or being turned back by divine intervention. The path to Hyperborea could not be forced, it had to be granted. This exclusivity added to the mystique of Hyperborean figures, making their visits even more precious and their teachings more valued. The literary works attributed to Hyperborean authors, though none survive today, were highly regarded in antiquity. Besides Olen's hymns, there were philosophical treatises, medical texts, and books of prophecy supposedly written by Hyperborean sages. These works were cited by later authors as authorities on various subjects, though always at second or third hand. The loss of these texts was lamented by ancient scholars, who believed they contained wisdom that could transform human understanding. The artistic representations of Hyperborean figures in Greek art showed them as idealized humans, taller and more beautiful than ordinary mortals, but not monstrous or alien. They were depicted wearing distinctive clothing, often white robes with golden trim, and carrying symbols of Apollo like laurel branches or small lyres. Their faces showed a serenity unknown in portraits of ordinary humans, a visual representation of their spiritual perfection. These artistic conventions influenced later depictions of divine and semi-divine beings in Western art. As the ancient world gave way to medieval and then modern times, the approach to understanding Hyperborea shifted from mythological acceptance to scientific investigation. Scholars, explorers, and theorists attempted to locate the historical reality behind the legend, proposing various theories about where Hyperborea might have been and what natural phenomena might have inspired the stories. This scientific quest for Hyperborea reveals as much about the evolution of human knowledge as it does about the enduring power of the myth itself. Medieval scholars, inheriting both classical texts and Christian worldview, struggled to reconcile Hyperborea with biblical geography. Some placed it near the earthly paradise, suggesting that the Hyperboreans were descendants of those who had lived near Eden before the flood. Others identified it with the land of Gog and Magog mentioned in Scripture, transforming the blessed Hyperboreans into apocalyptic figures. The medieval Mappae Mundi, circular world maps that combined geography with theology, sometimes showed Hyperborea as a region in the far northeast, marked with wonders and warnings. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical texts and more systematic attempts to locate Hyperborea using improved geographical knowledge. Scholars like Olaus Magnus, writing about Scandinavia in the 16th century, suggested that Hyperborea might have been an ancient name for Sweden or Norway. He pointed to the midnight sun of the Arctic summer and the long polar nights as possible inspirations for the strange solar behaviour described in ancient accounts. The discovery of warm springs in Iceland, creating pockets of greenery in an otherwise frozen landscape, seemed to offer a natural explanation for the eternal spring of Hyperborea. The age of exploration opened new possibilities for Hyperborean theories. As European explorers pushed into the Arctic, they encountered phenomena that seemed to match ancient descriptions. The aurora borealis, with its dancing lights and ethereal beauty, might have inspired stories of Hyperborean temples glowing with divine light. The Sami people of Lapland, with their shamanic traditions and reindeer herding culture, were sometimes identified as descendants of the Hyperboreans. Their joik singing tradition, with its hypnotic repetitive patterns, seemed to echo descriptions of Hyperborean music. The discovery of mammoth remains in Siberia led to fascinating theories about Hyperborea. Some 18th century scholars proposed that Hyperborea had been a temperate region in what was now the Arctic, destroyed by a sudden climate change that flash froze the mammoths. This catastrophic event would explain why Hyperborea was no longer accessible and why its exact location remained mysterious. The theory combined emerging understanding of extinction and climate change with attempts to rationalize ancient myths. The development of comparative mythology in the 19th century placed Hyperborea in a broader context of Indo-European traditions. Scholars noted similarities between Hyperborea and other mythical northern lands in various cultures. The Hindu Mount Meru, the Buddhist Shambhala, and the Iranian Aryanam Vaja all shared characteristics with Hyperborea: northern location, spiritual perfection, and inaccessibility to ordinary mortals. These parallels suggested that Hyperborea might preserve memories of an actual place known to the common ancestors of these cultures. Geological theories about Hyperborea multiplied as understanding of Earth's history improved. Some scientists proposed that Hyperborea had been located on a now sunken landmass in the Arctic Ocean. Others suggested it might have been Greenland during a warmer climatic period. The discovery of fossil plants in the Arctic, showing that the region once enjoyed a temperate climate, seemed to support these theories. The concept of continental drift, though not fully accepted until the 20th century, offered new ways to imagine how a blessed land might have existed in what was now frozen wasteland. The search for the Riparian Mountains, the legendary barrier protecting Hyperborea, occupied many theorists. Various mountain ranges were proposed as candidates: the Urals, the Caucasus, the Carpathians, even the Himalayas. Each identification required explaining why ancient Greeks would have known about such distant mountains and why they associated them with Hyperborea. The fact that no mountain range perfectly matched the ancient descriptions led some to conclude that the Riparian Mountains were purely mythical, a narrative device rather than a geographical feature. Archaeological investigations in northern Europe and Asia occasionally uncovered artifacts or sites that enthusiasts claimed as evidence of Hyperborea. The discovery of advanced ancient cultures in Siberia, such as the Scythians and their elaborate golden artworks, suggested that the far north had indeed harboured sophisticated civilizations. The mysterious Arkham site in Russia, with its circular fortified settlement dating to the Bronze Age, was proclaimed by some as a Hyperborean city, though mainstream archaeologists remained sceptical. The linguistic approach to finding Hyperborea examined place names and tribal names across northern Eurasia for connections to the Greek term. Some scholars suggested that the Hyperboreans might have been a real people whose name was Hellenized into its Greek form. Various candidates were proposed: the Avars, a nomadic people from Central Asia, the Iberians, ancestors of the modern Georgians, even the Hebrews, through creative etymology. None of these identifications gained widespread acceptance, but they demonstrated the continuing desire to find historical reality behind the myth. Astronomical theories about Hyperborea focused on the unusual solar phenomena described in ancient sources. The 6-month day and 6-month night clearly referred to polar conditions, but the eternal sunshine was harder to explain. Some theorists proposed that Hyperborea had been located at the North Pole during a period when Earth's axis was tilted differently, creating different seasonal patterns. Others suggested that the ancient accounts confused or combined observations from different latitudes, mixing Arctic phenomena with temperate conditions. The role of the amber trade in Hyperborean theories deserves special attention. Amber from the Baltic reached the Mediterranean through long trade routes, and its northern origin was known to the Greeks. Some scholars proposed that Hyperborea was simply a mythologized version of the Baltic amber sources, with traders' tales growing more fantastic with each retelling. The sacred offerings sent from Hyperborea to Delos might have been amber shipments, their religious significance a cover for commercial transactions. The development of anthropology brought new perspectives to understanding Hyperborea as a cultural phenomenon rather than a geographical reality. Anthropologists studied how myths of distant paradise lands functioned in societies, serving psychological and social needs regardless of their factual basis. The Hyperborean myth was compared to cargo cults, millenarian movements, and other beliefs in perfect worlds that would arrive or be discovered. This approach shifted focus from finding Hyperborea to understanding why humans needed to believe in it. Modern Arctic exploration in the 19th and 20th centuries definitively mapped the polar regions, leaving no room for an undiscovered Hyperborea. Yet each expedition that failed to find the mythical land also discovered genuine wonders that seemed to validate aspects of the ancient stories. The discovery of hot springs and volcanic activity in Iceland, Greenland, and other Arctic regions showed that pockets of warmth could exist in frozen lands. The observation of Arctic mirages, where atmospheric conditions create illusions of distant lands floating in the sky, might explain some fantastic elements of Hyperborean descriptions. The Nazi obsession with Hyperborea in the early 20th century represents one of the darkest chapters in the myth's history. Heinrich Himmler and other Nazi ideologues claimed that Hyperborea had been the original homeland of the Aryan race, twisting ancient myths to support their racist ideology. They funded expeditions to Tibet and the Arctic, searching for traces of this supposed Aryan paradise. This appropriation of Hyperborea demonstrated how ancient myths could be weaponized for political purposes, stripped of their spiritual and philosophical meaning and reduced to propaganda. Post-war scholars worked to reclaim Hyperborea from its political abuse, returning to serious study of its role in ancient thought. The development of structuralist anthropology offered new tools for understanding how the Hyperborean myth functioned within Greek culture. Claude Lévi-Strauss's theories about binary oppositions in myth helped explain Hyperborea as a necessary counterpoint to Greek civilization, embodying everything Greece was not: peaceful rather than warlike, unified rather than divided, eternal rather than mortal. Psychological interpretations of Hyperborea drew on Jungian concepts of the collective unconscious and archetypal symbols. Hyperborea was seen as a projection of the self, the integrated personality that transcends ego limitations. The journey to Hyperborea represented individuation, the psychological process of becoming whole. The fact that Hyperborea was unreachable by ordinary means symbolized that self-realization required extraordinary inner work, not just external travel. Environmental science brought new relevance to Hyperborean myths in the context of climate change. As the Arctic warmed due to human activity, some regions were indeed becoming more hospitable, though hardly the paradise of ancient imagination. The myth of Hyperborea was invoked in discussions about how humans imagine and respond to environmental change, with the lost paradise serving as both warning and hope. If the Arctic had once been warm enough for Hyperborea, what did that mean for our future? Satellite archaeology and remote sensing technologies offered new ways to search for possible Hyperborean sites. Surveys of Siberia and the Arctic Ocean floor revealed previously unknown geological features and evidence of ancient human activity. While nothing approaching the mythical Hyperborea was found, these discoveries showed that the prehistoric Arctic had been more complex and populated than previously thought. Each discovery added nuance to our understanding of what might have inspired the ancient stories. The study of oral traditions among Arctic peoples provided potential connections to Hyperborean myths. Indigenous stories from Siberia, Alaska, and Canada sometimes mentioned ancestral memories of warmer times or lost homelands. While these traditions couldn't be directly linked to Greek Hyperborea, they suggested that collective memories of climate change and migration might persist in mythological form for millennia. The universality of paradise myths among northern peoples hinted at shared experiences or cultural exchanges lost to history. Genetic studies of population movements added another dimension to Hyperborean theories. The discovery that Indo-European peoples had migrated from the Pontic-Caspian steppe raised questions about what memories they might have carried of their northern origins. Could Hyperborea preserve very ancient recollections of the steppe homeland, transformed through millennia of retelling? The genetic evidence couldn't answer such questions definitively, but provided new frameworks for thinking about myth transmission. The emergence of systems theory and complexity science offered new models for understanding how myths like Hyperborea evolved and persisted. Rather than seeking a single origin or meaning, researchers began to see Hyperborea as an emergent property of cultural systems, constantly recreated through interaction between tradition and innovation. Each culture that encountered the myth added layers of meaning, creating a palimpsest that could never be fully decoded to reveal an original truth. Digital humanities projects have created databases of all references to Hyperborea in ancient literature, allowing unprecedented analysis of how the myth developed over time. Computer modelling of trade routes and population movements has suggested new possibilities for how Hyperborean traditions might have spread. Virtual reconstructions of possible Hyperborean landscapes based on ancient descriptions and modern Arctic knowledge allow people to explore the mythical land in immersive detail, though these remain imaginative exercises rather than historical recreations. The search for Hyperborea in the modern era has increasingly become a search for meaning rather than location. Scholars recognize that the power of the myth lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its ability to inspire and challenge human imagination. Hyperborea represents the eternal human dream of perfection, always placed just beyond reach, always retreating as we advance. In this sense, the scientific search for Hyperborea has succeeded not by finding it, but by revealing why we need to keep looking. The transformation of Hyperborea from Greek religious concept to Roman literary device marks the beginning of its long cultural evolution through Western civilization. As the myth passed through different cultures and historical periods, it accumulated new meanings while shedding others, demonstrating the remarkable plasticity of mythological traditions. Each era reimagined Hyperborea according to its own preoccupations and possibilities, creating a succession of Hyperboreas that revealed as much about their interpreters as about the original myth. Roman writers approached Hyperborea with a different sensibility than their Greek predecessors. Where Greeks had seen a religious mystery connected to Apollo, Romans often treated it as a poetic convention or geographical curiosity. Virgil mentioned the Hyperboreans in his Georgics as dwelling at the world's edge, but without the spiritual significance they held for earlier writers. Pliny the Elder catalogued Hyperborean traditions in his Natural History with the same detached interest he showed toward any foreign customs. This rationalization began the slow transformation of Hyperborea from sacred space to literary topos. Yet some Romans maintained deeper engagement with Hyperborean spirituality. The Emperor Augustus claimed special connection to Apollo and may have incorporated Hyperborean symbolism into his religious reforms. The Carmen Saeculare of Horace, performed at Augustus's secular games, invoked Apollo in terms that echoed Hyperborean traditions. Elite Romans, who underwent initiation into Greek mysteries, would have encountered Hyperborean teachings, though filtered through centuries of interpretation and adaptation. The rise of Christianity presented challenges for the survival of Hyperborean traditions. Early Christian writers had to decide whether pagan myths contained any truth worth preserving or were entirely demonic deceptions. Some church fathers dismissed Hyperborea as pure fantasy, while others attempted to reconcile it with biblical history. Clement of Alexandria suggested that the Hyperboreans might have possessed partial truth through natural revelation, preparing the way for the gospel. This charitable interpretation allowed Hyperborean elements to survive in Christianized form. Medieval chroniclers occasionally mentioned Hyperborea when discussing the world's edges and the distribution of peoples after Noah's flood. The Venerable Bede placed Hyperborea vaguely in the north, populated by descendants of Japheth. Medieval maps sometimes showed Hyperborea near the earthly paradise, suggesting spiritual kinship between the pagan blessed land and Christian heaven. These geographical speculations kept Hyperborea alive in learned discourse, even as its pagan religious significance was suppressed or forgotten. The medieval Romance tradition transformed Hyperborea into a setting for chivalric adventures. In some versions of the Alexander Romance, the great conqueror reaches Hyperborea in his quest to explore the world's limits. The land of eternal youth, sought by various knights, resembled Hyperborea in its blessed nature and inaccessibility. These romantic adaptations stripped away most classical details while preserving the core concept of a perfect northern realm beyond mortal reach. Byzantine scholars, maintaining Greek language and learning, preserved more authentic Hyperborean traditions than their Western counterparts. The Suda, a 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, contained entries on Hyperborea and Abaris that preserved ancient sources otherwise lost. Byzantine commentaries on classical texts kept alive scholarly discussion of Hyperborean geography and significance. This preservation work proved crucial when Western Europe rediscovered classical learning during the Renaissance. The Renaissance brought explosive renewed interest in Hyperborea as humanist scholars recovered and translated ancient texts. Marsilio Ficino, translating Plato and the Hermetic corpus, encountered Hyperborean themes that resonated with his Neoplatonic philosophy. The idea of a blessed land where humans lived in harmony with divine forces aligned perfectly with Renaissance ideals of human perfectibility. Hyperborea became a symbol of the golden age that humanist education and spiritual reform might restore. Renaissance cartographers faced the challenge of placing Hyperborea on increasingly accurate world maps. Some followed medieval tradition in locating it in the far northeast. Others identified it with newly discovered lands in the Americas. The Zeno map of 1558 showed a free land in the North Atlantic that some interpreted as Hyperborea. These cartographic attempts to pin down Hyperborea's location reflected Renaissance confidence that all ancient mysteries could be solved through proper application of reason and investigation. The Protestant Reformation brought new interpretations of Hyperborea. Some Reformed theologians saw it as evidence of natural religion, proof that even pagans could perceive divine truth through creation. Others used Hyperborean perfection to criticize Catholic corruption, arguing that even mythical pagans lived more virtuously than the Roman Church. The Radical Reformation, with its emphasis on direct divine inspiration, found parallels between Hyperborean spiritual practices and their own mystical experiences. The scientific revolution challenged literal belief in Hyperborea while finding new relevance in its symbolism. Francis Bacon used Hyperborea metaphorically in his New Atlantis, representing the perfect society that scientific progress might achieve. The Royal Society's investigations of magnetism and polar phenomena included discussions of whether Hyperborean myths might preserve ancient observations of Arctic conditions. This scientific engagement with myth established patterns of interpretation that continue today. Enlightenment philosophers deployed Hyperborea in their critiques of European society. Voltaire mentioned the Hyperboreans ironically, using their supposed perfection to highlight human imperfection. Rousseau's noble savage owed something to Hyperborean traditions of natural virtue, uncorrupted by civilization. The Encyclopédie included an entry on Hyperborea that balanced skeptical analysis with acknowledgement of its cultural significance. These Enlightenment treatments secularized Hyperborea while preserving its utility as philosophical example. The Romantic movement rediscovered Hyperborea's spiritual and emotional power. German Romantics especially embraced Hyperborea as symbol of lost wholeness and connection to nature. Friedrich Schelling incorporated Hyperborean themes into his Nature philosophy, seeing in the myth evidence of humanity's original unity with the divine. The Brothers Grimm collected folk tales that seemed to preserve Hyperborean elements, suggesting deep cultural memories embedded in popular tradition. The 19th century's fascination with nationalism gave Hyperborea new political significance. Various European peoples claimed Hyperborean ancestry to establish their historical priority and spiritual superiority. Swedish scholars argued that Hyperborea had been located in Scandinavia, making Swedes the original blessed people. Russian mystics placed Hyperborea in Siberia, connecting it to ideas of Russia's spiritual mission. These nationalist appropriations began the dangerous politicization of Hyperborea that would culminate in the 20th century. The theosophical movement of the late 19th century gave Hyperborea central importance in its alternative history of human evolution. Helena Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine described Hyperborea as the second root race of humanity, ethereal beings who lived before physical incarnation. This esoteric interpretation influenced numerous occult groups and new religious movements, creating a parallel tradition of Hyperborean mythology distinct from both classical sources and academic scholarship. The symbolist movement in art and literature found in Hyperborea a perfect expression of their aesthetic ideals. The Russian poet Velimir Klebnikov wrote of Hyperborea as the future paradise that revolutionary Russia would become. The artist Nicholas Roerich painted Hyperborean landscapes that captured its otherworldly beauty. These artistic interpretations emphasized Hyperborea's psychological and spiritual truth over any historical reality. The modernist period brought both skeptical deconstruction and mythic reimagining of Hyperborea. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland contained fragments of Hyperborean imagery transformed into symbols of spiritual desolation and lost wholeness. Ezra Pound's Cantos included references to Hyperborea as part of his syncretic mythology. These modernist appropriations fragmented and reassembled Hyperborean traditions, creating new meanings through juxtaposition and illusion. The horror writer Clark Ashton Smith created a prehistoric Hyperborea as setting for dark fantasy stories, populated by dinosaurs and decadent sorcerers. This pulp fiction, Hyperborea, completely divorced from classical traditions, established new conventions that influenced subsequent fantasy literature. The transformation of Hyperborea from blessed land to site of cosmic horror demonstrated the myth's capacity for complete inversion while retaining recognizable identity. Post-World War II culture had to reckon with the Nazi appropriation of Hyperborean mythology. Scholars worked to separate legitimate historical and cultural study from racist pseudo-history. The myth's contamination by political extremism made it radioactive for mainstream academic study, while simultaneously attracting continued interest from fringe groups. This complicated legacy continues to affect how Hyperborea is discussed and understood today. The New Age movement of the late 20th century embraced Hyperborea as one of many alternative spiritual traditions. Channelers claim to receive messages from Hyperborean masters, workshops promised to teach Hyperborean healing techniques, and books revealed the secret location of underground Hyperborean cities. This popular spiritualization of Hyperborea, however distant from ancient sources, demonstrated the myth's continued ability to inspire hope for human transformation. Contemporary fantasy literature and gaming have created numerous versions of Hyperborea, each adapted to its fictional universe's needs. From Robert Howard's Conan stories to modern role-playing games, Hyperborea serves as a versatile setting for adventures. These popular culture appropriations, while bearing little resemblance to classical Hyperborea, keep the name alive and introduce new generations to at least the concept of a mythical northern paradise. Academic study of Hyperborea now focuses primarily on its reception history, tracing how different cultures have interpreted and transformed the myth. This metacritical approach treats Hyperborea as a lens through which to examine cultural change, intellectual history, and the dynamics of myth transmission. The impossibility of recovering an original, authentic Hyperborea has become less important than understanding the myth's remarkable adaptability and endurance. Digital culture has created new spaces for Hyperborean mythology to evolve. Online communities devoted to alternative history, esoteric spirituality, and fantasy world-building all engage with Hyperborean themes. Virtual worlds and video games allow players to explore their own versions of Hyperborea. These digital manifestations represent the latest phase in Hyperborea's long cultural evolution, demonstrating that ancient myths can find new life in unexpected media. The 20th and 21st centuries have witnessed the most dramatic and often troubling transformations of the Hyperborean myth, as it became entangled with political ideologies, conspiracy theories, and new religious movements. The story of Hyperborea in modern times reveals how ancient myths can be weaponized for contemporary purposes, while simultaneously inspiring genuine spiritual seeking and creative expression. This period has produced more diverse and contradictory interpretations of Hyperborea than all previous centuries combined. The early 20th century occult revival placed Hyperborea at the center of alternative histories of human civilization. The Theosophical Society, following Helena Blavatsky's teachings, described Hyperborea as the second root race in humanity's evolution, beings of pure energy who gradually densified into physical form. According to this doctrine, Hyperboreans possessed psychic powers lost to modern humans, but potentially recoverable through spiritual practice. This interpretation influenced numerous esoteric groups, each adding their own elaborations to the basic narrative. Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy offered a different vision of Hyperborea, integrating it into a complex spiritual cosmology. Steiner taught that Hyperborean humanity existed when Earth itself was in a more ethereal state, before the solidification that created current physical conditions. His followers established schools and communities attempting to reconnect with Hyperborean consciousness through education, agriculture, and arts. This movement demonstrated how Hyperborean mythology could inspire practical applications in modern life. The most notorious modern appropriation of Hyperborea came from German Völkisch movements and ultimately Nazi ideology. Guido von List and Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels incorporated Hyperborea into their Aryosophist teachings, claiming it as the original homeland of the Aryan race. These ideas influenced Heinrich Himmler, who established the Ahnenerbe organization to research ancient Germanic history, including supposed connections to Hyperborea. Nazi expeditions to Tibet and the Arctic searched for traces of Hyperborean civilization, believing it would validate their racial theories. The Nazi Hyperborea bore no resemblance to the blessed land of Greek mythology. Instead of a peaceful paradise devoted to Apollo, it became a warrior kingdom of racial supermen. The 1,000-year lifespan of Hyperboreans was reinterpreted as genetic superiority that could be recovered through racial purity. The spiritual perfection of classical Hyperborea was replaced with biological determinism and master race ideology. This perversion of the myth had devastating real-world consequences, contributing to the ideological framework that justified genocide. Post-war esotericism had to grapple with Hyperborea's contamination by Nazi ideology. Some groups, like Julius Evola's traditionalists, continued to promote racialized interpretations of Hyperborea, though usually with more philosophical sophistication than crude Nazi propaganda. Others worked to reclaim Hyperborea from political extremism, emphasizing its universal spiritual significance rather than ethnic associations. This struggle over Hyperborea's meaning continues in contemporary esoteric circles. The French writer René Guénon incorporated Hyperborea into his theory of primordial tradition, the original spiritual wisdom from which all religions descended. He identified Hyperborea with the polar symbolism found in various traditions, seeing it as the earthly center from which sacred knowledge spread. His influence extended through the traditionalist school, affecting thinkers like Frithjof Schuon and Ananda Coomaraswamy. This interpretation emphasized Hyperborea's metaphysical rather than historical significance. Russian mysticism developed unique interpretations of Hyperborea, often connected to ideas about Russia's spiritual destiny. Alexander Dugin and other neo-Eurasianist thinkers have promoted Hyperborea as the sacred center of a future Russian-led civilization opposed to Western materialism. These geopolitical interpretations blend ancient mythology with contemporary nationalism, creating new forms of political mythology. The Russian archaeological establishment has sometimes supported searches for Hyperborea in Siberia, lending official credibility to mythological speculation. The New Age movement of the 1960s and beyond embraced Hyperborea as one of many alternative spiritual traditions. Channelers claimed contact with Hyperborean masters who offered wisdom for humanity's transformation. Crystal healing, sound therapy, and other alternative practices were attributed to recovered Hyperborean knowledge. While often historically baseless, these interpretations provided meaning and hope for seekers dissatisfied with conventional religion and materialism. Contemporary conspiracy theories have woven Hyperborea into elaborate narratives about hidden history and secret powers. Some claim that Hyperborean technology is hidden in underground bases in Antarctica or the Arctic. Others assert that world elites are descendants of Hyperboreans, possessing advanced knowledge kept from ordinary humanity. These theories spread rapidly through internet communities, mixing genuine mythology with science fiction and paranoid speculation. Academic scholarship has responded to these popular appropriations with increased rigor in studying Hyperborea's actual role in ancient culture. Scholars emphasize the distance between classical sources and modern interpretations, working to educate the public about how myths evolve and can be misused. This scholarly work provides an important counterweight to sensationalist and extremist appropriations. Though it reaches a smaller audience than popular mythology, environmental movements have found new relevance in Hyperborean mythology as climate change transforms the Arctic. The image of a warm, fertile Arctic in the deep past resonates with current observations of polar melting. Some environmentalists invoke Hyperborea as a warning about climate transformation, while others see it as hope that life can flourish even after dramatic environmental change. These ecological interpretations give ancient mythology unexpected contemporary relevance. Indigenous rights activists have criticized the use of Hyperborean mythology to erase or appropriate actual Arctic peoples' histories. The search for a mystical white civilization in the Arctic can overshadow the real cultures that have inhabited these regions for millennia. This critique highlights how even well-intentioned mythological speculation can have colonialist implications, privileging imaginary ancient civilizations over living indigenous communities. Modern paganism and polytheistic reconstructionism have attempted to restore Hyperborean elements to contemporary Apollo worship. These practitioners research ancient sources to understand Hyperborea's role in classical religion, incorporating Hyperborean themes into rituals and meditation. While acknowledging that physical Hyperborea never existed, they find spiritual value in contemplating the perfect devotion and harmony it represented. Literary critics have analysed how Hyperborean themes appear in modern literature, from high modernism to contemporary fantasy. The myth serves various narrative functions: lost paradise, unattainable goal, source of ancient wisdom, or site of cosmic horror. Each literary appropriation adds layers to Hyperborea's cultural significance, demonstrating the myth's continued vitality as a source of creative inspiration. Psychological interpretations have evolved beyond simple Jungian archetypes to explore Hyperborea's role in collective trauma and aspiration. The myth of a lost, perfect world resonates with experiences of displacement, alienation, and longing for community. Therapists working with mythology find that Hyperborean imagery can help clients articulate desires for transformation and fears of isolation. This therapeutic application gives ancient mythology practical relevance in addressing modern psychological needs. Digital archaeology and virtual reality have created new ways to explore and experience Hyperborea. Researchers use computer modelling to visualize possible Hyperborean landscapes based on ancient descriptions. Virtual reality experiences allow users to walk through reconstructed Hyperborean temples and cities. While these remain imaginative exercises, they demonstrate how technology can make mythology tangible in unprecedented ways. The commercialization of Hyperborea in gaming, entertainment, and tourism raises questions about cultural appropriation and trivialization. Video games set in Hyperborea, tourist packages to supposed Hyperborean sites, and merchandise featuring Hyperborean symbols transform sacred mythology into consumer products. This commodification parallels similar processes affecting other spiritual traditions, highlighting tensions between preservation and popularization. Contemporary art continues to find inspiration in Hyperborean themes. Installation artists create immersive environments evoking Hyperborean perfection or loss. Musicians compose works based on descriptions of Hyperborean harmony. Performance artists explore what Hyperborean thousand-year lives might mean for human identity. These artistic interpretations keep Hyperborea alive as a source of creative inspiration while adding new layers of meaning. The rise of genetic testing and population genetics has prompted new pseudoscientific claims about Hyperborean ancestry. Companies offering genetic ancestry tests sometimes include fanciful interpretations linking customers to ancient civilizations, including Hyperborea. Scientists have had to repeatedly debunk claims that genetic markers prove Hyperborean descent, highlighting ongoing tensions between scientific research and mythological speculation. Social media has accelerated the spread and mutation of Hyperborean mythology. Memes mixing classical sources with modern interpretations circulate rapidly, creating hybrid versions of the myth. Online communities devoted to Hyperborea range from serious historical discussion to wild speculation to extremist propaganda. This digital proliferation makes controlling or correcting Hyperborean narratives nearly impossible. The question of how to teach Hyperborea in educational settings has become increasingly complex. Educators must balance teaching about the myth's historical significance with awareness of its modern political appropriations. Students need to understand both what ancient Greeks believed about Hyperborea and how those beliefs have been transformed and sometimes weaponized. This pedagogical challenge reflects broader issues about teaching controversial historical topics. Current debates about Hyperborea often serve as proxies for larger cultural conflicts. Arguments about whether Hyperborea was really in Scandinavia or Russia or elsewhere mask nationalist competitions for historical priority. Disputes about Hyperborean racial identity reflect contemporary anxieties about demographics and immigration. The myth becomes a battlefield for competing visions of history, identity, and human potential. The literary journey of Hyperborea from ancient poetry to contemporary fiction reveals how a mythological concept can inspire endless creative reimagining across millennia. Writers and artists have found in Hyperborea a perfect vehicle for exploring themes of perfection and loss, aspiration and impossibility, the divine and the human. Each artistic interpretation adds new dimensions to the myth while drawing on its accumulated cultural resonance, creating a vast body of work that spans every genre and medium. Ancient Greek literature established the foundational imagery and themes that would influence all subsequent Hyperborean art. Pindar's odes painted Hyperborea in luminous verses, describing the blessed land where Apollo's chosen people lived in eternal celebration. His poetry established key motifs: the golden light that bathed everything, the constant music and dancing, the absence of disease, and sorrow. These poetic conventions became so firmly established that later writers could evoke Hyperborea with just a few well-chosen images. The Homeric hymns, though not mentioning Hyperborea directly, established the relationship between Apollo and the far north that would become central to Hyperborean mythology. The god's winter journey to the land beyond the north wind became a recurring theme in Greek poetry, symbolizing the cycle of divine presence and absence. Poets used Apollo's Hyperborean sojourn to explore themes of longing, separation, and reunion that resonated beyond religious significance. Greek tragic drama occasionally referenced Hyperborea, usually as a contrast to the suffering portrayed on stage. In Aeschylus's fragments, Hyperborea appears as the antithesis of tragic fate, a place where the conflicts driving drama cannot exist. Sophocles used Hyperborean imagery to heighten tragic irony, reminding audiences of perfect happiness, while showing its impossibility for tragic heroes. These dramatic uses established Hyperborea as a literary device for measuring human limitation against divine possibility. Hellenistic poetry transformed Hyperborea into a more self-consciously literary creation. Callimachus and other Alexandrian poets used Hyperborean references as displays of erudition, weaving obscure variants of the myth into elaborate poetic conceits. Their Hyperborea became increasingly artificial and aesthetic, beautiful but emotionally distant. This scholarly approach influenced how later periods would treat mythological material as something to be preserved and analysed rather than believed. Roman poets inherited Hyperborea as part of the Greek literary tradition they sought to equal and surpass. Virgil's Georgics mentioned the Hyperboreans in passages about the world's extremes, using them to mark the boundaries of Roman agricultural knowledge. Ovid's Metamorphoses included Hyperborean elements in stories of transformation, suggesting that even the blessed northern land was subject to change. These Roman adaptations began Hyperborea's transformation from religious concept to purely literary device. Medieval literature rarely mentioned Hyperborea directly, but its influence appeared in various forms. The land of eternal youth sought by Celtic heroes resembled Hyperborea in its blessed nature and inaccessibility. The French Romance tradition's various paradise gardens and enchanted kingdoms drew on Hyperborean imagery filtered through centuries of transmission. The medieval imagination transformed Hyperborea into something more familiar to Christian audiences while preserving its essential otherness. Dante's Divine Comedy, while not referencing Hyperborea explicitly, incorporated similar concepts in its vision of the earthly paradise atop Mount Purgatory. The eternal spring, the perfect harmony, the direct divine presence all echoed Hyperborean themes. This Christian appropriation of pagan paradise imagery demonstrated how deeply Hyperborean concepts had penetrated Western imagination, surviving even when their original context was forgotten. Renaissance literature rediscovered Hyperborea through renewed access to classical texts. Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen included northern blessed lands that combined Hyperborean and Arthurian elements. Shakespeare never mentioned Hyperborea directly, but his late romances' magical islands and transformed worlds drew on the same tradition of blessed lands beyond ordinary geography. These Renaissance adaptations integrated Hyperborea into the emerging tradition of literary romance. The Baroque period's elaborate aesthetic found perfect expression in Hyperborean imagery. Poets crafted increasingly ornate descriptions of the blessed land, competing to capture its supernatural beauty in language. The German poet Martin Opitz wrote elaborate odes placing Hyperborea in the Baltic region, flattering noble patrons by suggesting their lands were the legendary paradise. This courtly appropriation of Hyperborea demonstrated how classical mythology could serve contemporary political purposes. Enlightenment satire deployed Hyperborea ironically to critique European society. Voltaire's references to Hyperboreans in his philosophical tales used their supposed perfection to highlight human imperfection. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, while not mentioning Hyperborea, created similar satirical paradises that exposed civilization's failings through contrast. This satirical tradition established Hyperborea as a useful tool for social criticism. Romantic poetry rediscovered Hyperborea's emotional and spiritual power. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan evoked Hyperborean imagery in its vision of Xanadu, another paradise lost to time. Percy Shelley's Prometheus Unbound included northern paradise imagery in its vision of humanity's liberation. These romantic appropriations emphasized Hyperborea as symbol of lost wholeness and future possibility rather than historical reality. German Romanticism particularly embraced Hyperborea as expression of Nordic spiritual superiority. Friedrich Hölderlin's Hyperion used the name's similarity to Hyperborea to explore themes of exile from perfection. Novalis incorporated Hyperborean imagery into his mystical Christianity, seeing in the northern paradise a prefiguration of spiritual transformation. This German tradition would have profound and sometimes troubling influence on later interpretations. Victorian literature transformed Hyperborea into a destination for adventure stories. William Morris's prose romances sent heroes to northern paradises combining Hyperborean and Norse elements. Lord Dunsany's fantasy stories placed Hyperborea at the edge of his imaginary worlds, always glimpsed but never reached. These adventure narratives established conventions that would influence 20th century fantasy literature. The symbolist movement found in Hyperborea perfect expression of their aesthetic philosophy. The Russian poet Alexander Blok wrote of Hyperborea as Russia's spiritual destiny, combining national mysticism with classical mythology. The French symbolists used Hyperborean imagery to evoke states of consciousness beyond ordinary expression. This symbolist Hyperborea emphasized suggestion and atmosphere over narrative coherence. Modernist literature fragmented and reassembled Hyperborean mythology in revolutionary ways. Ezra Pound's Cantos incorporated Hyperborean references into his syncretic mythology, juxtaposing ancient wisdom with modern chaos. H.D.'s poetry used Hyperborean imagery to explore female spiritual experience excluded from patriarchal tradition. These modernist appropriations demonstrated how ancient mythology could be renewed through formal experimentation. The weird fiction of the early 20th century transformed Hyperborea into a site of cosmic horror. Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborean cycle portrayed it as a prehistoric continent ruled by sorcerers and stalked by monsters. This dark Hyperborea influenced subsequent horror and fantasy writers, establishing an alternative tradition completely divorced from classical sources. The transformation of paradise into nightmare reflected modern anxieties about progress and civilization. Robert E. Howard's Conan stories placed Hyperborea in his Hyborian age, a mythical prehistory where it served as one of many barbaric kingdoms. This pulp fiction Hyperborea bore no resemblance to the classical Blessed Land, instead being a cold, harsh country of warriors and witches. Howard's influence on fantasy gaming and literature spread this alternate Hyperborea widely, often displacing awareness of the original myth. Post-war literature grappled with Hyperborea's contamination by Nazi appropriation. Some writers avoided the subject entirely, while others deliberately subverted racist interpretations. Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness created an ambiguously gendered society in an Arctic setting that challenged assumptions about northern superiority. This critical engagement with Hyperborean themes demonstrated literature's capacity to reclaim and transform problematic mythologies. Contemporary fantasy literature has produced numerous versions of Hyperborea, each adapted to its fictional universe's requirements. George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire series includes northern lands beyond the wall that echo Hyperborean themes while subverting them. China Miéville's fiction incorporates Hyperborean references into his weird fiction aesthetic. These contemporary uses demonstrate Hyperborea's continued vitality as source material for imaginative literature. Graphic novels and comics have visualized Hyperborea in ways impossible in purely textual media. The comic series Hellboy portrayed Hyperborea as the origin of apocalyptic evil, complete with elaborate visual mythology. French bandes dessinées have created beautiful artistic interpretations of the classical Blessed Land. These visual narratives add new dimensions to Hyperborean mythology, making it accessible to audiences who might never encounter classical sources. Digital literature and interactive fiction have created new forms of Hyperborean narrative. Hypertext stories allow readers to explore different paths through Hyperborean mythology, creating personalized versions of the myth. Video game narratives set in Hyperborea let players experience the Blessed Land directly, though usually transformed into settings for combat and adventure, rather than contemplation and harmony. Contemporary poetry continues to find inspiration in Hyperborean themes. Poets use Hyperborea to explore environmental destruction, cultural loss, and impossible longing. The Canadian poet Anne Carson has incorporated Hyperborean references into her experimental classical adaptations. These poetic uses demonstrate how ancient mythology remains relevant for expressing contemporary concerns. The visual arts have produced countless representations of Hyperborea, from ancient Greek vase paintings to contemporary installations. Classical artists depicted Hyperboreans as idealized humans, taller and more beautiful than ordinary mortals. Medieval manuscripts showed Hyperborea as a walled garden at the world's edge. Renaissance paintings placed it in elaborate landscape settings, combining classical and contemporary elements. Romantic painters created sublime visions of Hyperborean landscapes, emphasizing their otherworldly beauty and spiritual significance. Caspar David Friedrich's Arctic scenes, while not explicitly Hyperborean, captured the mystical quality associated with the far north. The Russian painter Nicholas Roerich created an entire series of Hyperborean paintings, visualizing it as a spiritual kingdom of cosmic significance. Modern and contemporary artists have used Hyperborea conceptually rather than literally. Installation artists create immersive environments, evoking Hyperborean perfection or its loss. Video artists explore the impossibility of reaching paradise through looped footage of endless journeys. Performance artists embody Hyperborean thousand-year lives through durational works. These contemporary interpretations demonstrate how classical mythology can inspire new forms of artistic expression. Music inspired by Hyperborea ranges from classical compositions to extreme metal. Romantic composers created tone poems evoking Hyperborean landscapes. Contemporary classical composers have written operas and orchestral works based on Hyperborean themes. Electronic musicians create ambient soundscapes, imagining Hyperborean temple music. Black metal bands have adopted Hyperborea, a symbol of pagan resistance to Christianity. This musical diversity shows how the same myth can inspire radically different artistic expressions. The influence of Hyperborean aesthetics on architecture, while less direct than in other arts, appears in various utopian building projects. Architects designing meditation centers and spiritual retreats sometimes invoke Hyperborean principles of harmony with nature and sacred geometry. The circular temple described in ancient sources has inspired modern ceremonial structures. These architectural interpretations attempt to create physical spaces that embody Hyperborean ideals of perfection and spiritual elevation. Dance and movement practices have drawn inspiration from descriptions of Hyperborean sacred dances. Modern dance pioneers like Isadora Duncan imagined recovering ancient Greek movement traditions, including the perfect harmonies of Hyperborean ritual dance. Contemporary choreographers create works exploring themes of paradise lost and impossible perfection. Sacred dance practitioners claim to channel Hyperborean movement patterns through intuition and spiritual guidance. These embodied interpretations add kinesthetic dimensions to the mythology. Film and television have brought Hyperborea to screen in various forms, though rarely using the name directly. Movies depicting lost civilizations in the Arctic draw on Hyperborean imagery. Documentary films about polar exploration sometimes reference Hyperborean myths to contextualize historical expeditions. Animation allows for more fantastic interpretations, visualizing the blessed land in ways live action cannot achieve. These screen adaptations introduce Hyperborean concepts to mass audiences who might never encounter the original mythology. The development of virtual and augmented reality technologies has created unprecedented opportunities for experiencing imagined Hyperboreas. VR experiences allow users to walk through reconstructed Hyperborean temples, participate in virtual festivals, and explore impossible landscapes. AR applications overlay Hyperborean imagery onto real-world locations, transforming ordinary spaces into gateways to the mythical north. These immersive technologies make mythology experiential in ways previously impossible. The relationship between Hyperborea and other mythical paradises reveals universal patterns in how human cultures imagine perfection and locate it beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. These connections suggest either cultural exchange, parallel evolution of ideas, or perhaps shared psychological needs that generate similar myths across different societies. Understanding Hyperborea's place within this broader context of imaginary geography illuminates both its unique features and its participation in worldwide traditions of paradise mythology. The most frequently discussed parallel is between Hyperborea and Atlantis, though the two mythical lands served very different functions in ancient thought. While Hyperborea was a blessed land of spiritual perfection, Atlantis represented technological achievement, followed by moral corruption and destruction. Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical parable, while Hyperborea emerged from genuine religious tradition. Yet both lands shared the quality of being unreachable, existing in a past or distance that prevented verification. Modern occultists often link them, suggesting Hyperborea and Atlantis were contemporary civilizations or even the same place remembered differently. The connection between Hyperborea and Thule demonstrates how mythical geography evolved through transmission and interpretation. Thule, first described by the explorer Pytheas, was supposedly 6 days' sail north of Britain. While Pytheas probably reached Iceland or Norway, his description became increasingly mythologized. Medieval writers sometimes identified Thule with Hyperborea, other times distinguished them. The phrase Ultima Thule came to represent any extremely distant place, carrying forward Hyperborean associations of remoteness and mystery. The conflation of these two northern lands shows how mythical places could merge and separate depending on narrative needs. The Celtic otherworld, particularly the Irish Tir na Nog, shares remarkable similarities with Hyperborea. Both are lands of eternal youth where time moves differently, sorrow is unknown, and music fills the air. The other world's location across the Western Sea differs from Hyperborea's northern placement, but both exist at the world's edge, accessible only through divine favour or magical means. Some scholars suggest these similarities result from Indo-European heritage, others from cultural contact between Celtic and Greek worlds. The parallels extend to specific details. Both lands feature divine rulers, magical foods that sustain immortality, and inhabitants who occasionally visit the mortal world. The Hindu concept of Mount Meru presents fascinating parallels to Hyperborea, particularly in its polar symbolism. Meru stands at the world's centre, around which everything revolves, much like some interpretations placed Hyperborea at the pole. Both are homes of gods, sources of sacred rivers, and places where normal physical laws don't apply. The mountain is surrounded by circular continents and seas reminiscent of Greek descriptions of Hyperborean geography. These similarities have led some theorists to propose a common Indo-European tradition of a sacred northern centre, though direct connections remain speculative. Buddhist Shambhala shares Hyperborea's quality of being simultaneously physical and spiritual, real yet unreachable. Hidden somewhere in Central Asia, Shambhala preserves perfect wisdom until the world is ready to receive it. Like Hyperborea, it's inhabited by beings of exceptional virtue and longevity who live in harmony with divine law. The prophecy that Shambhala's king will emerge to defeat evil and establish a golden age echoes themes of Hyperborean perfection as future possibility. Modern theosophists explicitly connected Shambhala and Hyperborea, though traditional Buddhist sources make no such link. The Iranian Aryan Vajra, the original homeland of the Aryan peoples in Zoroastrian tradition, presents another northern paradise with Hyperborean characteristics. It enjoyed eternal spring until the evil spirit Angra Mainyu cursed it with winter. This transformation from paradise to frozen wasteland might preserve memories of climate change, similar to theories about Hyperborea's disappearance. The emphasis on this land as source of civilization and wisdom parallels Greek ideas about Hyperborean knowledge. Nazi ideologists exploited these similarities to construct their racist mythology, though the actual connections are linguistic and cultural rather than racial. The Norse Asgard and Valhalla offer interesting contrasts to Hyperborea despite superficial similarities. While both are divine realms associated with the North, Asgard is a warrior paradise of conflict and preparation for final battle, opposite to Hyperborea's eternal peace. Yet Norse mythology also includes Giml, a hall that will survive Ragnarok, where righteous humans will live in happiness, closer to Hyperborean ideals. The differences highlight how Northern European cultures develop their own distinct paradise concepts, while possibly preserving traces of older shared traditions. The Garden of Eden, while geographically placed in the Near East, shares fundamental characteristics with Hyperborea: perfect climate, absence of death and disease, direct divine presence, and loss through human failing or divine will. Medieval scholars sometimes try to reconcile these traditions, suggesting Hyperborea might have been settled by Eden's expelled inhabitants, or represented a partial preservation of paradise conditions. The universality of Paradise Lost narratives suggests deep psychological patterns that manifest differently in various cultures but address similar existential concerns. The Fortunate Isles, or Islands of the Blessed in Greek mythology, occupied a position similar to Hyperborea, but in the western rather than northern ocean. Heroes favoured by the gods lived there after death in circumstances resembling Hyperborean life. Eternal spring, abundant food, freedom from labour and sorrow. Some ancient authors confused or conflated these locations, suggesting they might be the same place reached by different routes. The multiplication of blessed lands in Greek geography reveals an imagination that couldn't be satisfied with just one paradise. The Chinese Kunlun mountain paradise shares Hyperborea's function as axis mundi and divine dwelling. Like Hyperborea, Kunlun is home to immortals who possess secret wisdom, particularly the Queen Mother of the West who controls access to immortality. The mountain's lower slopes are accessible to exceptional mortals, but its summit remains divine territory. Peaches of immortality grow there, paralleling Hyperborean foods that grant extended life. These Asian-European parallels might result from Silk Road cultural exchange or independent development of similar mythological concepts. The Aztec Aztlan, the legendary northern homeland of the Mexica people, demonstrates how origin paradise myths appear worldwide. Like Hyperborea, Aztlan was a perfect place left behind, now unreachable but still spiritually significant. The migration from Aztlan to central Mexico parallels stories of wisdom bearers travelling from Hyperborea to Greece. While no direct connection exists between these traditions, they show how cultures use mythical geography to explain their origins and validate their customs. The Islamic concept of Jabulka and Jabulsa, cities at the world's edges where the sun rises and sets, echo Hyperborean themes of peripheral perfection. These cities are inhabited by descendants of Moses who live in perfect righteousness, unknown to the corrupted central world. Like Hyperborea, they exist in geographical reality, yet remain inaccessible, preserving pure tradition until the end times. Medieval Islamic geographers debated their location, much as Greeks argued about Hyperborea, demonstrating parallel processes of mythological rationalization. Lemuria and Mu, hypothetical lost continents proposed by 19th century theorists, were often connected to Hyperborea in occult literature. These Pacific paradises supposedly preserved ancient wisdom before catastrophic destruction. Theosophists arranged them chronologically, with Hyperborea preceding Lemuria in human evolution. While lacking ancient sources, these modern myths show how paradise narratives continue evolving, incorporating scientific language while maintaining traditional structures. The hollow earth theory, popularized in the 19th century, sometimes placed Hyperborea at the polar opening to the inner world. This interpretation combined ancient mythology with pseudo-scientific speculation, creating new synthetic mythologies. The idea that Hyperboreans retreated underground to escape surface catastrophes appears in various modern, esoteric traditions. These theories demonstrate how ancient myths adapt to incorporate new cosmological possibilities. Modern UFO mythology occasionally incorporates Hyperborea as an ancient alien base or the location of first contact between humans and extraterrestrials. These interpretations replace divine beings with advanced aliens, transforming spiritual perfection into technological superiority. While completely divorced from ancient sources, these adaptations show how paradise myths evolve to reflect contemporary anxieties and aspirations. The multiverse concept in contemporary physics has inspired new interpretations of mythical lands as alternate realities. Some theorists propose that Hyperborea and similar paradises exist in parallel dimensions, occasionally accessible through natural or artificial portals. This scientific language updates ancient ideas about divine realms existing alongside but separate from ordinary reality. These modern interpretations demonstrate mythology's continued relevance for exploring concepts at the boundaries of knowledge. Virtual worlds and online games have created new forms of mythical geography where multiple paradises coexist. Players can visit versions of Hyperborea, Atlantis, Shambhala, and other legendary places within the same game universe. These digital spaces allow direct comparison and combination of different paradise traditions, creating hybrid mythologies that would have been impossible in traditional storytelling. The democratization of myth-making through user-generated content produces countless new Hyperboreas, each reflecting its creator's vision of perfection. The endurance of Hyperborea across nearly 3,000 years of Western culture reveals something profound about human nature and our need for transcendent ideals. Despite every attempt to locate, explain, or debunk it, Hyperborea continues to captivate imaginations and inspire new interpretations. Its legacy extends far beyond its origins as a Greek religious concept, touching philosophy, literature, politics, spirituality, and even science. The mystery of Hyperborea lies not in its geographical location, but in its ability to embody humanity's highest aspirations, while remaining forever beyond reach. The philosophical legacy of Hyperborea shaped Western thought in ways often unrecognized. The concept of an ideal society existing somewhere in space or time became a fundamental tool for political and social criticism. From Plato's Republic to Thomas More's Utopia to modern socialist visions, the Hyperborean model of perfection achieved through harmony with divine or natural law continues to influence how we imagine human potential. Every utopian project carries traces of Hyperborean DNA, the belief that somewhere, somehow, humans can transcend the limitations that define ordinary existence. The religious impact of Hyperborea extends through multiple traditions. The idea of a blessed land where humans live in direct contact with divinity influenced Christian concepts of paradise, both earthly and heavenly. Monastic communities attempting to create perfect Christian societies on earth unconsciously followed Hyperborean patterns. The Protestant vision of building God's kingdom on earth, particularly influential in American culture, echoes Hyperborean themes of establishing divine order in human society. Even secular spirituality movements promising transformation and transcendence draw on Hyperborean imagery of perfectible humanity. The scientific legacy of Hyperborea appears in how we approach anomalous evidence and lost civilizations. The search for Hyperborea contributed to Arctic exploration, archaeological methodology, and comparative mythology as academic disciplines. While Hyperborea itself was never found, the search for its advanced human knowledge in countless ways. The pattern continues today as scientists investigate climate history, human migrations, and cultural transmission. Every discovery of unexpected ancient sophistication or climate variation revives questions about what truths might hide within myths. The psychological significance of Hyperborea illuminates universal human needs that transcend cultural boundaries. The myth addresses fundamental existential anxieties: death, suffering, meaninglessness, isolation. It offers a vision of life without these limitations, not through denial but through imagining their absence. The persistence of paradise myths across all cultures suggests they serve essential psychological functions, providing hope, meaning, and direction. Hyperborea's specific form, northern, solar, musical, harmonious, reveals particular values and fears of the cultures that preserved and transformed it. The literary legacy of Hyperborea established conventions that continue shaping imaginative literature. The unreachable paradise, the blessed land at world's edge, the perfect society that judges our imperfection. These Hyperborean themes appear throughout Western literature. Fantasy literature's various immortal kingdoms, science fiction's advanced civilizations, Even detective fiction's locked room mysteries draw on patterns established by Hyperborean mythology. Writers need not know the original myths to use structures and symbols that descended from them through centuries of literary transmission. The political legacy of Hyperborea serves as both inspiration and warning. The dream of perfect society has motivated countless reform movements and revolutions. Yet the appropriation of Hyperborea by totalitarian ideologies demonstrates how paradise myths can justify terrible actions in pursuit of impossible perfection. The Nazi perversion of Hyperborean mythology remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of literalizing spiritual symbols and weaponizing ancient wisdom. Contemporary political movements still invoke Hyperborean themes, requiring constant vigilance against their misuse. The artistic legacy of Hyperborea continues evolving as new media create unprecedented possibilities for imagining paradise. Digital artists create immersive Hyperborean experiences impossible in traditional media. Musicians use electronic processing to approximate the perfect harmonies attributed to Hyperborean song. Filmmakers employ CGI to visualize landscapes that exist nowhere on Earth. These technological capabilities don't solve the mystery of Hyperborea, but multiply it, creating infinite variations on the theme of transcendent perfection. The ecological relevance of Hyperborea has unexpectedly increased as climate change transforms the Arctic. The vision of a warm, fertile Arctic paradise no longer seems impossible as ice melts and temperatures rise. Yet this physical warming brings catastrophe rather than paradise, inverting Hyperborean symbolism. Environmental movements invoke lost paradise narratives to motivate conservation, using Hyperborean imagery to represent what we stand to lose. The myth that once inspired exploration now cautions against destroying what remains unknown. The question of whether Hyperborea ever existed in any form remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing unexpected ancient sophistication, keeping alive possibilities that myths preserve historical memories. Climate science shows the Arctic has experienced dramatic changes, potentially supporting some Hyperborean descriptions. Yet the core elements, thousand-year lifespans, eternal spring in the far north, direct divine presence remain impossible within known natural law. The tension between possible and impossible keeps Hyperborea alive as mystery rather than settled history. The modern proliferation of Hyperborean interpretations through internet culture has democratized myth-making while fragmenting coherent tradition. Anyone can now create and share their version of Hyperborea, leading to explosive diversification of the mythology. Online communities develop elaborate Hyperborean theories combining ancient sources, pseudoscience, and pure imagination. This participatory mythology creates new forms of meaning-making, but also spreads misinformation and extremist ideologies. The challenge becomes preserving valuable cultural heritage while allowing creative reinterpretation. The educational value of Hyperborea for teaching critical thinking and cultural literacy continues growing. The myth's complex history provides perfect case studies for examining how stories change through transmission, how evidence and imagination interact, how political ideologies appropriate cultural symbols. Students analysing Hyperborea learn skills applicable far beyond mythology: source criticism, cultural context, symbolic interpretation, and recognition of propaganda. The myth becomes a lens for understanding how humans create and transform meaning. The therapeutic potential of Hyperborean imagery in healing and personal development remains largely unexplored. The vision of perfect harmony and extended life offers powerful metaphors for psychological integration and growth. Meditation practices incorporating Hyperborean visualizations report profound experiences of peace and transcendence. The myth's emphasis on music, movement, and community provides models for holistic healing approaches. These applications suggest mythology's continued relevance for addressing contemporary psychological and spiritual needs. The future of Hyperborea seems assured as long as humans need symbols for perfection and transcendence. New technologies will create new ways to imagine and experience the mythical paradise. Climate change may make Arctic paradise physically possible while socially impossible. Space exploration might project Hyperborean dreams onto other worlds. Genetic engineering could attempt to create the 1,000-year lifespans of mythical Hyperboreans. Each development will generate new interpretations of the ancient myth, adding layers to its already complex legacy. The mystery of Hyperborea ultimately lies not in its historical or geographical reality, but in its psychological and spiritual truth. It represents something essential about human consciousness: the ability to imagine perfection despite experiencing only imperfection. This imaginative capacity drives both our greatest achievements and our most terrible failures. Hyperborea stands as a perpetual reminder that paradise exists primarily in human consciousness, challenging us to manifest whatever portion of it we can in the imperfect world we inhabit. The wisdom of Hyperborea, if such exists, might be precisely its unreachability. By remaining forever beyond the north wind, it maintains its power to inspire without the disappointment of reality. Every earthly paradise fails because perfection cannot survive contact with human nature. But Hyperborea, existing only in imagination and aspiration, remains eternally perfect, eternally inspiring, eternally mysterious. It teaches us that some truths are more valuable as mysteries than as facts, some places more important as dreams than as destinations. The conversation about Hyperborea continues across academic conferences, online forums, artistic venues, and spiritual gatherings. Each participant brings their own perspective, adding to the collective interpretation of this ancient mystery. Scholars debate historical sources, artists create new visions, believers seek spiritual truth, and skeptics demand evidence. This ongoing dialogue keeps Hyperborea alive as a living tradition rather than fossilized mythology. The myth evolves through discussion, adapting to new contexts while maintaining recognizable identity. The responsibility of those who study and transmit Hyperborean mythology grows more complex as the myth accumulates associations and interpretations. How do we honor ancient traditions while acknowledging modern additions? How do we prevent political appropriation while allowing creative freedom? How do we teach mythology's value without encouraging literalism or extremism? These questions have no easy answers, requiring constant negotiation between preservation and innovation, respect and critique. The personal meaning of Hyperborea varies for each individual who encounters the myth. For some, it represents lost innocence and impossible return. For others, it symbolizes future possibility and human potential. Still others see it as pure fantasy, valuable only as entertainment or historical curiosity. These diverse responses demonstrate mythology's capacity to serve multiple functions simultaneously, providing different gifts to different seekers. The myth becomes a mirror reflecting each person's hopes, fears, and beliefs. As we stand at the threshold of unprecedented global challenges, the vision of Hyperborea offers both warning and hope. It warns against the dangerous pursuit of impossible perfection that can justify terrible means. But it also provides hope that humans can imagine and work toward better ways of living. The Hyperborean ideal of harmony with nature and each other becomes increasingly relevant as we face environmental and social crises. Perhaps the myth's greatest gift is not the promise of paradise, but the inspiration to create whatever approximation of it we can achieve. The ending of this story cannot be written because Hyperborea's story never truly ends. Each generation rediscovers and reimagines it, finding new meanings in ancient symbols. Children hearing about the magical land beyond the north wind for the first time experience the same wonder that Greek children felt millennia ago. Artists inspired by Hyperborean imagery create works that will influence future artists in ways we cannot predict. Scholars uncover new sources and propose new theories that revise our understanding of the myth's origins and development. In conclusion, Hyperborea remains what it has always been, a mystery that reveals more about those who seek it than about its own nature. It stands at the intersection of history and myth, reason and imagination, possible and impossible. The blessed land beyond the north wind continues to call to something deep in human nature, the part that refuses to accept limitation and suffering as final truths. Whether Hyperborea ever existed in physical reality matters less than its continued existence in cultural imagination. As long as humans dream of transcendence, Hyperborea will endure, forever beyond reach, forever inspiring the reach itself. The legacy of Hyperborea teaches us that myths are not lies or mistakes, but essential tools for navigating the complexity of human existence. They encode wisdom that cannot be captured in factual statements, preserve possibilities that material reality cannot accommodate, and inspire achievements that pragmatism alone would never attempt. Hyperborea's 1,000-year journey through Western culture demonstrates mythology's vital role in human meaning-making, a role that continues despite all our scientific knowledge and technological power. And so the land beyond the north wind remains forever on the horizon of human imagination, neither approaching nor receding, neither proven nor disproven, neither found nor lost. It exists in the eternal present of mythology, where Apollo still dwells among his blessed people, where spring never ends, where harmony prevails, and where the human dream of perfection finds its purest expression. This is the true mystery and lasting legacy of Hyperborea, not a place to be found, but a vision to inspire, not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be contemplated, not a destination to be reached, but a direction to guide our eternal journey towards something better than what we are. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the mists of time and imagination to explore the eternal mystery of Hyperborea. If you enjoyed discovering this legendary paradise beyond the north wind, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history's most fascinating mysteries and forgotten worlds. Until next time, may you carry a piece of that eternal spring within your own heart, and may your own journey, like that of the ancient seekers, always lead you toward wonder.